July 2021 brought an oppressive heat to the Appalachian foothills of western North Carolina. I had been living on our family property in the remote sections of the Blue Ridge Mountains for 3 years now, helping my parents maintain the 40-acre homestead that had been in our family for generations. The isolation suited me after my discharge from the Army. The mountains provided the kind of silence and solitude that helped quiet the restless thoughts that plagued me since my return from overseas. Our property stretched across a series of rolling hills and deep hollows, with a modest farmhouse sitting at the center like a weathered sentinel. Behind the house we had constructed a large fenced enclosure that housed our small herd of goats and a flock of chickens. The animals provided both sustenance and purpose, giving structure to days that might otherwise drift by aimlessly in the mountain quiet. The fence itself was a patchwork of necessity. 6 feet of chain link in most places, reinforced with wooden posts and topped with a single strand of barbed wire. It wasn't pretty, but it kept the goats contained and most predators out. The enclosure backed up against a steep drop-off that plunged nearly 50 feet into a rocky ravine thick with laurel and rhododendron. Beyond that lay thousands of acres of national forest, dark and primeval, where the old-growth trees blocked out most of the sky and created a perpetual twilight even at noon. I had grown comfortable with the rhythms of mountain life. The morning chores, the afternoon maintenance work, the evening rounds to check on the animals. My parents worried about me sometimes, I knew. They thought the isolation wasn't healthy for someone my age, that I should be socializing more, maybe finding work in town. But they didn't understand how the noise and chaos of civilization felt like sandpaper against my nerves now. Here among the animals and the ancient trees, I could breathe. That particular evening in July, the heat had been brutal all day. Even after sunset, the air hung thick and still, pressing down on everything like a suffocating blanket. The goats had been restless throughout the afternoon, clustering in whatever shade they could find and bleating irritably at anyone who came near. I had filled their water troughs twice, trying to keep them comfortable, but nothing seemed to settle them. I had gone out to my truck around 9:30 that evening, needing to retrieve my work gloves from the cab so I could repair a section of fencing that had come loose during the previous week's storm. The vehicle sat in our gravel driveway about 100 yards from the animal enclosure, and as I rummaged through the clutter in the passenger seat, I heard something that made my blood freeze. The sound that reached my ears was unlike anything I had heard in 3 years of living on the mountain. It was the sound of panic, pure, animalistic terror. The goats were screaming, their voices cracking with fear as they crashed against the fence with such force that I could hear the chain link rattling from where I stood. Mixed with their cries was a frantic fluttering and squawking from the chickens, the kind of noise they made when a fox got into the coop. But this was different. Louder, more desperate. I abandoned my search for the gloves and ran toward the house, my heart hammering against my ribs. As a combat veteran, I had learned to recognize the difference between ordinary alarm and mortal terror. This was the latter. Something was in that enclosure with my animals, something that had driven them into a frenzy of fear. The screen door slammed behind me as I rushed into the house and made a beeline for the gun cabinet in my father's study. My hands shook slightly as I worked the combination, muscle memory from countless training drills warring with the adrenaline coursing through my system. The AR-15 felt familiar and reassuring in my hands as I grabbed it along with a loaded magazine. My mother appeared in the hallway, her face creased with worry. "What's happening out there?" she asked, pulling her robe tight around herself. "Something's got the animals spooked," I said, checking the rifle's action with practiced efficiency. "I'm going to check it out." "Be careful," she called after me. But I was already out the door and jogging across the yard toward the enclosure. The sounds of distress grew louder as I approached. In the pale light cast by the security lamp mounted on the barn, I could see the entire herd of goats pressed against the far side of the pen, as far from the ravine as they could get. They were still bleating and calling, their eyes wide with terror, but they seemed unharmed. The chickens had retreated to their coop and fallen silent, but I could see several sets of eyes glinting in the darkness as they huddled together. I fumbled with the gate latch, my fingers clumsy with urgency. The metal was warm to the touch from the day's heat, slick with humidity. As the gate swung open, several of the goats tried to push past me, desperate to escape whatever had frightened them. I had to use my body to block their way, speaking in low, calming tones while I moved into the enclosure. "Easy, easy," I murmured, though my own voice sounded strained and artificial. "It's okay now." But I didn't believe my own words. Something was still wrong. I could feel it in the way the night air seemed to press against my skin, in the unnatural stillness that had settled over everything except the animal's continued distress. I moved slowly through the enclosure, the rifle held at the ready, my finger resting against the trigger guard. Years of military training had taught me to trust my instincts, and every instinct I possessed was screaming that I was not alone. The goats followed my movement with their eyes, but they remained clustered together, unwilling to venture more than a few feet from the gate. The enclosure was roughly rectangular, perhaps 60 feet by 40 feet, with the long side running parallel to the ravine. I worked my way along the perimeter, checking each section of fence for damage or signs of intrusion. Everything appeared intact, but the animal's behavior told a different story. Something had been here, something that had terrified them beyond reason. As I approached the section of fence that overlooked the ravine, the hairs on the back of my neck began to rise. The drop-off here was steep and rocky, with the fence line following the edge of the cliff for about 20 feet before turning away from the precipice. It was the most vulnerable part of our perimeter, though I had never worried about it before. Nothing could climb up that sheer rock face. I was wrong. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. The desecurity light didn't reach this far corner of the enclosure, and the moon was only a thin crescent, casting barely enough light to distinguish shapes from shadows. But as I drew closer, crouching low and moving with the careful steps I had learned in Afghanistan, the shape beyond the fence began to resolve into something that made my mouth go dry with fear. There was a figure crouched just beyond the fence line, perhaps 10 feet from where I stood. It was motionless, almost statue-like, positioned at the very edge of the ravine where the ground dropped away into darkness. At first glance, it might have been a person. The general proportions were human-like, but something about its posture and stillness marked it as fundamentally other. The thing's skin, what I could see of it in the dim light, had an ashen quality that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the meager illumination. It appeared to be naked, its flesh stretched taut over what looked like an unnaturally thin frame. The head was turned away from me, but I could see that it was hairless and oddly shaped, as if the skull beneath had been compressed or elongated. For perhaps 30 seconds, we remained frozen in this tableau, me crouched behind the fence with my rifle, the figure motionless at the edge of the abyss. The only sounds were the continued bleating of the goats behind me, and the distant whisper of wind through the trees far below in the ravine. Then, with a movement so sudden it made me flinch, the thing turned its head toward me. What I saw in that moment will haunt me for the rest of my life. The face that looked back at me was a nightmare fusion of human and something else entirely. The basic structure was recognizably human. 2 eyes, positioned where eyes should be, a mouth in the proper location. But everything else was wrong in ways that my mind struggled to process. The skin was the color of old ash, gray-blue, and mottled like the flesh of something long dead. Where a nose should have been, there were only 2 dark slits that seemed to pulse slightly with each breath. The mouth was a thin line with no visible lips, as if the flesh had been stretched tight across the skull. But it was the eyes that truly terrified me. They were large and round, much larger than human eyes had any right to be, and they glowed with a pale bluish light that seemed to come from within, not the reflective shine of an animal's eyes in lamplight, but something deeper and more unnatural. They held an intelligence that was unmistakably aware, unmistakably focused on me. The hands, God help me. The hands were the worst part. 5 fingers on each hand, but each finger was elongated and ended in what looked like a yellowed claw or talon. The arms appeared to be too long for the body, giving the creature an ape-like proportion that was nonetheless distinctly wrong. For what felt like hours but must have been only seconds, we stared at each other across the fence. I became acutely aware of my own breathing, of the sweat that had broken out across my forehead despite the night air, of the way my hands trembled slightly as I raised the rifle to my shoulder. The creature watched me bring the weapon to bear with what I can only describe as curiosity. Its head tilted slightly to one side, and those awful eyes tracked the movement of the rifle barrel as I aimed it at the center of its chest. There was no fear in its expression, no recognition of the threat I posed. It simply observed as if I were the curiosity in this encounter. My thumb found the safety switch and clicked it off with a sound that seemed thunderously loud in the night silence. At that small mechanical noise, the creature's head snapped upright, and its mouth fell open in what I initially thought was surprise. What came out was the sound that still wakes me up some nights, sweating and gasping for breath. The sound that emerged from that lipless mouth was like nothing in the natural world. It began as a high, keening wail that might have been human. might have been a woman in mortal agony, but it was wrong in pitch and tone. The sound seemed to bypass my ears and strike directly at some primitive part of my brain, the part that recognized the cry of an apex predator. As the wail continued, it began to distort and change, taking on harmonic frequencies that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. It was as if multiple voices were screaming in unison, layered one atop the other until the sound became a wall of anguish and rage that filled the night air. The goats behind me went mad with terror. I could hear them crashing against the fence, their bleating rising to match the pitch of the creature's cry. One of them, our oldest billy goat, actually tried to clear the 6-foot fence and nearly succeeded, his hooves scrabbling against the chain link as he fell back into the enclosure. But I couldn't look away from the thing at the ravine's edge. As it screamed, it began to rise from its crouch, unfolding like some terrible flower blooming in reverse. The proportions became even more nightmarish as it stood, the torso too thin, the limbs too long, the head too large for the spindly neck that supported it. It stood nearly 8 feet tall, a scarecrow silhouette against the star-filled sky. For a moment it swayed slightly, as if testing its balance or perhaps savoring the fear it had instilled. Then those pale eyes fixed on me once more, and I saw something in them that made my finger tighten on the trigger. Recognition. It knew me. Before I could fire, the creature pivoted on one impossibly long leg and took a single step backward, a step that should have sent it tumbling into the ravine. Instead, it seemed to hang in the air for a moment, suspended over the abyss by nothing but willpower or some force I couldn't comprehend. Then it was gone. Not fallen, not disappeared into the darkness, gone. One moment it was there, a towering shadow against the night sky, and the next there was only empty air and the sound of disturbed rocks tumbling into the depths below. I remained frozen in my shooting stance for perhaps 5 minutes, my rifle aimed at the spot where the creature had stood, waiting for it to reappear. But the night had returned to its normal sounds, the chirping of crickets, the distant hoot of an owl, the gradually subsiding panic of my animals. My legs felt like water as I stumbled back toward the gate. The rifle seemed to weigh 100 pounds in my hands, and I had to stop twice to avoid falling as waves of delayed shock rolled through my system. The goats parted before me like a furry sea, still agitated but no longer in the grip of absolute terror. I managed to get the gate closed and latched, though my hands shook so badly it took 3 attempts. The simple mechanical action of securing the enclosure felt absurdly normal after what I had just witnessed, like brushing your teeth after surviving a plane crash. The run back to the house passed in a blur of stumbling steps and ragged breathing. I burst through the front door with such force that I nearly tore it from its hinges, causing my mother to cry out in alarm from where she sat waiting in the living room. "What happened?" she demanded, rising from her chair as I leaned the rifle against the wall and engaged every lock on the front door. "You look like you've seen a ghost." If only it had been something so benign as a ghost. I tried to explain what I had encountered, but the words came out in a jumbled rush that sounded insane even to my own ears. A creature at the fence, gray skin like ash, eyes that glowed, 8 feet tall, disappeared into thin air. My mother listened with the patient expression she had perfected during my childhood. The look that said she was taking me seriously even when she clearly thought I was making things up. But as I continued my account describing the creature's appearance and the sound it had made, I saw something change in her face. "You're shaking," she observed quietly, "and you're pale as a sheet." She was right. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving me cold and clammy despite the warm night. My hands trembled as I accepted the glass of water she pressed into them, and I had to use both hands to keep from spilling it. "Something was out there," I said, my voice hoarse from strain. "Something that shouldn't exist." My father appeared in the doorway, drawn by the commotion. He took in the scene, his son disheveled and shaking, his wife hovering with maternal concern, the rifle propped against the wall, and his expression grew serious. "Tell me what happened," he said simply. So I did. I told him everything, from the first sounds of distress from the animals to the creature's impossible disappearance into the ravine. He listened without interruption, his weathered face growing more troubled with each detail. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window toward the dark bulk of the mountains. "There are things in these hills," he said finally, "that most people don't want to believe in. Things that were here long before we were, and that will be here long after we're gone. My father had been born and raised in these mountains, as had his father before him. The family had owned this land for 5 generations, and with that ownership had come stories. Stories that were usually dismissed as folklore, or the products of overactive imaginations. But sitting in our living room that night, with the taste of terror still fresh in my mouth, those stories took on a different weight. "Your great-grandfather used to talk about seeing things in the woods," my father continued, settling into his favorite chair with the careful movements of a man whose joints had been worn down by decades of physical labor. Things that looked almost human but weren't. The Cherokee who lived here before us had names for them, warnings about places in the forest where you shouldn't go alone. He gestured toward the window, where the mountains rose like sleeping giants against the star-filled sky. This whole region is honeycombed with caves and hollow spaces. Some of the cave systems go down for miles, connecting to underground rivers and chambers that nobody has ever fully explored. If something wanted to hide, to live without being detected, this would be the perfect place. My mother made a skeptical sound. "You're not seriously suggesting that there are unknown species living in the mountains, are you? In this day and age, with satellites and GPS and trail cameras everywhere?" "I'm suggesting," my father replied carefully, "that there are still places on this earth where humans rarely go, and things that most humans wouldn't want to encounter. Just because we've mapped the surface doesn't mean we understand what lies beneath it." He turned to me, his expression grave. "The important thing is that you don't go out there alone after dark anymore. Whatever you saw, whatever it was, it's shown interest in our property. That makes it dangerous." I wanted to argue, to insist that I wasn't going to be driven from my own land by some inexplicable encounter. But the memory of those pale, intelligent eyes was too fresh, too vivid. There had been something in that gaze that spoke of hunger, of patience, of a predator evaluating its prey. "What about the animals?" I asked. "If that thing comes back, we'll install motion sensor lights around the perimeter," my father said. "And maybe it's time to get a dog, a big one." We spent the rest of the night making plans, discussing practical measures we could take to improve security around the property. But beneath the mundane conversation about lighting and fencing and alarm systems, we all understood the unspoken truth. We had crossed some invisible threshold. The isolation that had once felt peaceful now carried an undertone of menace. As dawn broke over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, I stood at the kitchen window and looked out toward the ravine. In the growing light, everything looked normal and innocent. The fence line was intact. The animals were grazing peacefully, and there was no sign that anything unusual had occurred. But I knew I would never look at those woods the same way again. September brought the first hint of autumn to the mountains, with leaves beginning to turn and a crisp edge to the morning air that promised winter was not far behind. The incident in July had begun to feel distant, like a bad dream that loses its power in daylight. We had installed the motion sensor lights my father had suggested, and acquired a German Shepherd mix from the local animal shelter, a dog named Thor who took his guardian duties seriously. Life had returned to something resembling normal. The animals showed no signs of ongoing distress, and I had resumed my evening walks around the property without incident. The rifle still accompanied me on these outings, but more from habit than from any sense of immediate danger. It was during one of these walks that I encountered my old friend Garrett, who had recently inherited a cabin about 2 miles deeper into the mountains. He and several mutual friends had been using it as a weekend retreat, a place to escape the pressures of their jobs in Charlotte and Asheville. "You should come up sometime," Garrett suggested as we stood talking beside my truck. "We've got a group going up this weekend, and Brad found some kind of old foundation or something about a half-mile from the cabin. We thought we'd check it out." The idea of spending time with friends, of returning to some semblance of normal social interaction, appealed to me. The isolation that had once been a refuge was beginning to feel more like a prison, and I realized I missed the easy camaraderie of male friendship. Saturday afternoon found me hiking through the forest with Garrett and 3 other friends, following an overgrown trail that wound its way through dense stands of oak and maple. The foundation Brad had discovered turned out to be the remains of an old homestead, probably dating back to the early 1900s. Stone chimney remnants and the outline of what had once been a small cabin were still visible beneath decades of accumulated leaves and undergrowth. We spent perhaps an hour exploring the site, speculating about who might have lived there and why they had abandoned it. The afternoon was wearing on, and the shadows were growing longer when I suggested we head back to the cabin. "You guys go ahead," Garrett said, crouching beside what looked like an old well foundation. "I want to check this out a little more. I'll catch up." "I'll wait," offered Brad, and the other two friends echoed the sentiment. But I was feeling increasingly uneasy as the light faded. The incident in July had left me with a heightened sensitivity to isolated places after dark, and this abandoned homestead had an atmosphere that made my skin crawl. "I'm going to head back," I announced. "See you guys back at the cabin." The trail back was well marked and easy to follow, even in the growing dusk. I had walked perhaps a quarter mile when I heard my name being called from somewhere behind me. "Hey, wait up." It was Garrett's voice, unmistakably familiar but strange somehow. Distorted. I stopped and turned, peering back through the trees toward where I had left my friends. "Garrett?" I called back. The response came from a different direction entirely, from somewhere off to my left where no trail existed. "Over here, come look at this." But it wasn't quite right. The words were Garrett's. The voice was recognizably his, but there was something underneath it, a quality that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. Something that reminded me of another voice, another sound that had filled the night air with terror and impossible harmonics. I turned and ran. Behind me, the voice continued calling, but now it was coming from multiple directions at once, echoing through the trees with increasing urgency and decreasing humanity. By the time I reached the cabin, my heart was pounding and my shirt was soaked with sweat. Garrett and the others arrived 20 minutes later, laughing and talking as they emerged from the trail. All of them, together. "Did you call out to me?" I asked Garrett when I could trust my voice to remain steady. He looked puzzled. "No, why? You said you were heading back, so we figured we'd see you here." To this day, I don't know what called my name in the woods that evening. I don't know if it was the same entity I encountered at the ravine, or something else entirely, but I do know that some sounds, once heard, change you forever. They teach you that the world is larger and stranger and more dangerous than you ever imagined. And they teach you that sometimes the smartest thing you can do is run. It has been over a year since that night in July, and I still have no rational explanation for what I saw at the edge of the ravine. I've researched everything I can think of. Local folklore, Native American legends, reports of unusual animal sightings in the region. I found stories that echo elements of my experience, but nothing that provides definitive answers. The Cherokee did indeed speak of creatures that dwelled in the deep places of the earth. Beings that were neither human nor animal, but something in between. They warned against venturing alone into certain areas after dark, and they had rituals for protection against what they called the Watchers in the Stone. There is an old Cherokee burial ground about 3 miles from our property, dating back several centuries. Local historians suggest it may have been a sacred site for much longer than that, perhaps extending back to prehistoric times when the mountains were home to peoples whose names have been lost to history. But academic research and historical documentation can only take you so far when you're trying to understand an encounter that defies rational explanation. What matters is not whether such creatures officially exist, but whether they exist in fact, and based on what I experienced that night, what I saw with my own eyes and heard with my own ears, I am certain that we share these mountains with intelligences that predate human civilization. I still live on the family property, though I've taken my father's advice to heart. I don't venture out alone after dark, and I've developed a healthy respect for the depth and darkness of the mountain wilderness. Thor has proven to be an excellent guardian, and his presence provides both practical security and psychological comfort. The animals have shown no signs of the terror that gripped them that night in July, but I sometimes notice them clustering together near the barn when the wind blows from the direction of the ravine. They remember, as I remember. I may never know what I encountered at the fence line, or what called my name in the woods using my friend's voice, but I know enough to be grateful that I survived both encounters, and wise enough to hope that I never have another. Some questions are better left unanswered. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. And some things that watch from the darkness are better left undisturbed. The year was 2018, and I had just turned 13 that March. My cousin Jenny, who was 10 at the time, had come to stay with our family for spring break at our cabin nestled deep in the mountains of northern Colorado. The cabin had been in our family for generations, a rustic 2-story structure with weathered wood siding and a wraparound porch that creaked ominously whenever the wind picked up through the towering pines. Those first few days of break had been perfect. Jenny and I spent our mornings exploring the dense woods surrounding the property. building makeshift forts from fallen branches, and skipping stones across the small lake that sat like a mirror reflecting the snow-capped peaks in the distance. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine needles and the promise of spring's arrival. Our families had always been close. My Aunt Patricia, Jenny's mother, was my father's younger sister, and every year we looked forward to these spring gatherings at the cabin. The adults would spend their evenings on the porch, sharing stories and sipping coffee while Jenny and I would curl up by the stone fireplace inside, playing card games or reading old books we'd found tucked away in the cabin's dusty corners. But it was on the fourth day of our stay that everything changed. The morning had started like any other. Jenny and I woke early, before the adults, and made ourselves bowls of cereal while planning our day's adventures. The sun streamed through the kitchen windows, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors, and birds chirped cheerfully in the trees outside. "Let's go to that place Dad mentioned yesterday," Jenny suggested between spoonfuls of cereal. "The one with the good pancakes." She was referring to Pine Grove Diner, a small family restaurant about 15 minutes down the winding mountain road from our cabin. My uncle had recommended it the previous evening, claiming they served the best breakfast in 3 counties. The prospect of fluffy pancakes and crispy bacon was too tempting to resist, especially after days of our own amateur cooking attempts. When the adults finally emerged from their bedrooms, yawning and reaching for coffee, we practically bounced with excitement as we shared our breakfast plans. Aunt Patricia laughed at our enthusiasm, ruffling Jenny's already messy blonde hair. All right, she said, still chuckling. "Let me get dressed and we'll head over there. But you two need to brush your teeth first." The drive to Pine Grove Diner wound through some of the most beautiful countryside I'd ever seen. Towering evergreens lined both sides of the narrow road, their branches heavy with remaining patches of winter snow. Occasionally we'd catch glimpses of wildlife, a deer bounding gracefully through the underbrush, or a red-tailed hawk circling overhead against the crystal blue sky. Pine Grove Diner looked exactly like what you'd expect from a mountain restaurant. It was a low rectangular building with knotty pine siding and large windows that offered stunning views of the surrounding wilderness. A hand-painted sign hung from the eaves, depicting a tall pine tree with the restaurant's name carved into the trunk in rustic lettering. The interior was warm and welcoming, with red checkered tablecloths, antler chandeliers, and walls decorated with vintage photographs of the area's logging history. The smell of bacon grease and maple syrup filled the air, making my stomach rumble with anticipation. A cheerful waitress with graying hair and kind eyes seated us at a booth near one of the large windows. Jenny ordered a stack of chocolate chip pancakes while I opted for the lumberjack special. 3 eggs, hash browns, bacon, and thick slices of French toast. The adults settled on more modest fare, but their eyes lit up when they tasted the restaurant's famous coffee blend. As we ate, I couldn't help but notice the other patrons. Most appeared to be locals, weathered men in flannel shirts and work boots, families with young children who spoke in hushed tones, elderly couples sharing quiet conversations over steaming mugs. There was something comforting about the atmosphere, a sense of community and belonging that you didn't often find in the city. "This place has been here since 1952, our waitress, whose name tag read Dolores, told us as she refilled the adults' coffee cups. "My grandmother actually worked here when it first opened. Same family's been running it all these years." The conversation flowed easily as we enjoyed our meal. Jenny and I shared stories of our adventures from the past few days, while the adults caught up on family news and reminisced about their own childhood visits to the cabin. The food was every bit as delicious as promised, and I found myself eating far more than I probably should have. It was as we were finishing up, our plates nearly empty and our stomachs pleasantly full, that Dolores made the casual comment that would change everything. "You know," she said, wiping down a nearby table, "if you folks have little ones, there's a nice playground area out back. Nothing fancy, mind you, but the kids seem to enjoy it." Jenny's eyes immediately lit up with interest. Despite being 10, she still loved swings and slides, and the prospect of working off our heavy breakfast with some outdoor play was appealing to both of us. "Can we go check it out?" she asked, turning to Aunt Patricia with pleading eyes. "I don't see why not," Aunt Patricia replied, glancing at my parents for confirmation. "Just stay where we can see you, and don't wander off into the woods. There's a back door just past the restrooms," Dolores added helpfully. "Follow the path and you'll find it easily enough." The back door of Pine Grove Diner opened onto a small wooden deck with steps leading down to what appeared to be a well-worn dirt path. The transition from the warm, cozy interior of the restaurant to the cool mountain air was jarring, and I pulled my jacket tighter around my shoulders as Jenny and I stepped outside. The path was narrow, perhaps 3 feet wide, and carved through a dense section of pine trees that grew so close together their branches formed an almost complete canopy overhead. Sunlight filtered through the needles in scattered beams, creating an ethereal, dappled effect on the ground below. The air was thick with the scent of pine resin and decomposing leaves, and somewhere in the distance I could hear the gentle babbling of a small stream. "This is kind of spooky," Jenny whispered as we began walking down the path. Her voice seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness of the woods, and I found myself automatically lowering my own voice in response. "It's just trees," I replied, though I had to admit there was something unsettling about the way the path curved ahead of us, disappearing into shadows between the massive tree trunks. Dolores said it wasn't far. The path was obviously well used, worn smooth by countless footsteps over the years. But as we walked deeper into the woods, I began to notice things that didn't quite fit with my expectations of a children's playground. Empty beer bottles lay scattered in the underbrush, their glass surfaces clouded with age and weather. Cigarette butts dotted the ground like confetti, some so old they'd begun to decompose into the soil. "Look at all this trash," Jenny said, pointing to a rusted can that had been tossed carelessly beside a fallen log. "That's not very nice." I nodded in agreement, but something else was bothering me, more than the litter. The deeper we walked into the woods, the quieter it became. The cheerful bird songs that had filled the air back at the restaurant had faded to nothing, replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed to press in on us from all sides. Even the sound of the distant stream had disappeared. The path took a sharp turn to the right, following the contour of a small hill, and suddenly opened into a circular clearing, perhaps 50 feet in diameter. Tall pines ringed the space like ancient guardians, their massive trunks creating natural walls that blocked out most of the surrounding forest. The ground was mostly bare dirt, packed hard by years of foot traffic, with only a few stubborn weeds managing to push through the compacted soil. And there, in the center of the clearing, sat the most out-of-place piece of furniture I'd ever seen. It was a couch. Not just any couch, but a massive, overstuffed monstrosity that might once have been beige or tan but was now stained with substances I didn't want to identify. The fabric was torn in multiple places, revealing yellowed foam padding that spilled out like infected wounds. Springs protruded from the seat cushions at odd angles, and the wooden frame was warped and splitting in several places. "Why would someone put a couch out here?" Jenny asked, echoing my own thoughts exactly. The couch sat at an angle against the base of the largest pine tree in the clearing, as if someone had simply dragged it into the woods and abandoned it. Stains covered the armrests, some dark and rust-colored, others a sickly yellow-green that made my stomach turn. The smell coming from it was indescribable, a mixture of mildew, decay, and something else I couldn't identify but that made me want to cover my nose. "Let's keep looking for the playground," I said, eager to move away from the disturbing piece of furniture. "It's got to be around here somewhere." We circled the clearing, staying close to the tree line, and that's when we found them. At the far end of the space, partially hidden behind a cluster of smaller pines, stood the playground equipment Dolores had mentioned. But calling it a playground was generous in the extreme. The swing set was ancient, its metal frame so rusted that large flakes of orange oxide fell to the ground with every gust of wind. 2 swings hung from the crossbar, one missing its seat entirely, leaving only the chains dangling like the skeleton of some long-dead creature. The other swing had a seat, but it was cracked down the middle and tilted at a precarious angle. Next to the swing stood a small slide, though it too showed signs of severe neglect. The metal surface was pitted with rust holes, and the ladder rungs were bent and twisted. Someone had apparently tried to fix it at some point, because duct tape was wrapped around several of the support posts. But the tape had long since lost its adhesive properties and hung in gray, weathered strips. "This doesn't look very safe," Jenny observed, and I had to agree. The entire setup looked like it hadn't been maintained in decades, if ever. But it wasn't the swing set or slide that made my blood turn cold. It was what stood behind them, partially concealed by the shadows of the overhanging branches. At first glance it looked like monkey bars, a metal frame with horizontal bars running between 2 vertical supports. But as we moved closer, the true horror of the structure became apparent. The metal was not just rusted, it was twisted and mangled, as if something incredibly powerful had grabbed the bars and bent them into impossible shapes. Some of the crossbars had been completely torn away, leaving jagged metal edges that gleamed dully in the filtered sunlight. Wrapped around the top of the structure, wound loosely like a snake preparing to strike, was a thick black cord. It wasn't rope. The material looked more like electrical cable, the kind used for heavy industrial equipment. The cord was easily 20 feet long, coiled and looped around the monkey bars in a way that suggested it had been placed there deliberately rather than accidentally. But the black cord wasn't the most disturbing element. Hanging from another section of the structure was a yellow extension cord, the kind you might find in any hardware store. It dangled about 6 feet from the ground, and attached to its end was a light fixture, a bare bulb socket with a metal reflector that had once been chrome but was now green with oxidation. The entire setup looked wrong, like some sort of twisted art installation designed to unnerve anyone who stumbled across it. But there was nothing artistic about what hung from the black cord. It was a baby doll, suspended by what appeared to be a noose made from black fabric. The doll itself was horrifying. Its plastic body was cracked and discolored, and someone had drawn on its face with what looked like permanent marker, creating a grotesque parody of human features. The doll's arms and legs hung at unnatural angles, and its blonde hair was matted and filthy. "Oh God," Jenny whispered, pressing closer to my side. "That's really creepy." I wanted to tell her we should leave, that we should turn around and walk back to the restaurant immediately, but something held me frozen in place, staring at the macabre display. There was something deliberately menacing about the way everything was arranged, as if someone had carefully designed the scene to inspire fear and revulsion. And then Jenny pointed to something that made my heart stop completely. "Look over there," she said, her voice barely audible. "What is that?" About 15 feet away from the twisted monkey bars, partially hidden behind a cluster of saplings, was a structure that defied explanation. It looked like a doghouse, but it was enormous, easily large enough for a full-grown adult to crawl inside. The wooden walls were gray with age and rot, and the peaked roof was covered with moss and pine needles. But it was the opening that truly disturbed me. The entrance was perfectly round, cut with precision that suggested power tools rather than hand saws. It was positioned at exactly the right height for someone to crawl through on their hands and knees, and the interior was completely black, offering no hint of what might be inside. "I think there's someone in there," Jenny whispered, her small hand gripping my arm so tightly I could feel her fingernails through my jacket sleeve. I strained my eyes, trying to see into the darkness of the oversized doghouse. At first I saw nothing but shadows, but then as my vision adjusted, I began to make out what looked like fabric, dark clothing perhaps, or blankets. And there was something else, something that made my skin crawl with an instinctive terror I couldn't explain. Movement. Subtle, barely perceptible, but definitely there. A shift in the shadows, the suggestion of something breathing in the darkness of that awful structure. "We need to go," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded despite the fear that was building in my chest like a physical weight. "We need to go right now." But Jenny seemed transfixed by the doghouse, unable to look away from its dark opening. "Do you think it's a homeless person?" she asked. "Maybe we should try to help them." The innocence of her suggestion only made the situation more terrifying. I knew with a certainty that came from some primal part of my brain that whatever was inside that structure was not someone who needed our help. Everything about this place screamed danger. The abandoned furniture, the twisted playground equipment, the hanging doll, and now this oversized hiding place that could conceal anything or anyone. "Jenny," I said, more firmly this time, "we're leaving. Now." I grabbed her hand and started to pull her toward the path, but she resisted, still staring at the doghouse with a mixture of fear and fascination. "But what if they're hurt?" she protested. "What if they need help?" Before I could answer, we heard it. A sound that came from somewhere above us, drifting down through the pine branches like the voice of something that had no business existing in our world. It was high-pitched and mechanical, a whirring noise that seemed to oscillate in frequency, rising and falling in a pattern that was almost musical but completely alien. The sound was impossible to locate. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing off the trees and bouncing around the clearing in a way that made it impossible to determine its source. But there was something malevolent about it, something that spoke to every evolutionary instinct for survival that humans had developed over millennia. Jenny's grip on my hand tightened until it was almost painful. "What is that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't answer because I didn't know, but I knew we had to leave. Had to get away from this place before whatever was making that sound decided to reveal itself. The whirring continued, growing slightly louder, and I could swear I saw movement in the branches overhead. Not the natural swaying of pine boughs in the wind, but something deliberate and purposeful. "Run," I said, and this time there was no arguing. We turned and sprinted toward the path, leaving behind the horrible clearing with its grotesque playground and mysterious occupant. The whirring sound followed us, seeming to move through the trees parallel to our flight, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched by unseen eyes. The path that had seemed merely spooky on our way into the woods now felt like a tunnel of terror. The overhanging branches seemed lower, more threatening, and shadows moved in my peripheral vision in ways that made me question my sanity. Jenny ran ahead of me, her lighter frame allowing her to move more quickly over the uneven ground. And that's when disaster struck. I'd always been prone to leg cramps, especially when I was stressed or had been sitting too long. The heavy breakfast at Pine Grove Diner, combined with the sudden burst of adrenaline-fueled running, created the perfect conditions for my left calf muscle to seize up in a knot of pure agony. The pain was instant and debilitating. One moment I was running at full speed, the next I was stumbling and nearly falling as my leg cramped so severely I could barely put weight on it. The muscle felt like it was trying to tear itself apart, and waves of pain shot up and down my entire leg. "Jenny," I called out, my voice cracking with pain and fear. "Wait up." She turned and saw me limping badly, my face contorted with pain, and her eyes went wide with panic. The whirring sound was getting closer now, definitely following us, and I could hear other noises in the woods, the crack of breaking branches, the rustle of something large moving through the underbrush. "What's wrong?" Jenny asked, running back to help me. "Leg cramp," I gasped through gritted teeth. "Bad one. I can barely walk." The terror in her young face was heartbreaking. She was only 10 years old, and suddenly found herself in a nightmare situation with a cousin who could barely move. But Jenny had always been tough for her age, and she didn't fall apart. "Put your arm around my shoulder," she said, positioning herself on my left side. "We can make it together." So we hobbled down that terrifying path as fast as my injured leg would allow, Jenny supporting as much of my weight as her small frame could manage. Every step was agony, but the alternative, staying in those woods with whatever was making that awful sound, was unthinkable. The whirring seemed to fade somewhat as we made progress toward the restaurant. But I couldn't tell if that was because we were actually outrunning it or because my fear was affecting my hearing. Either way, I focused entirely on putting one foot in front of the other, ignoring the screaming pain in my calf and the terror that threatened to overwhelm my rational mind. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, we saw the back door of Pine Grove Diner ahead of us through the trees. The sight of that simple wooden door with its cheerful red paint and brass handle was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. We burst through the back door of the restaurant like survivors of some terrible disaster, which in many ways we were. The warmth and light of the interior was a shocking contrast to the nightmare we'd just escaped, and for a moment I couldn't quite process the fact that we were safe. Our families were still sitting at the booth where we'd left them, talking and laughing over cups of coffee. They looked up in surprise as we stumbled in, clearly not expecting us back so soon. "That was quick," my father said with a smile. "How was the playground?" Jenny and I exchanged glances, and I could see my own trauma reflected in her wide eyes. How could we possibly explain what we'd just experienced? How could we make them understand the horror of that place without sounding like we were making up ghost stories? "It was," I began, then stopped. The words wouldn't come. How do you describe the feeling of absolute wrongness that had permeated that clearing? How do you explain the terror of that whirring sound, or the certainty that something dangerous had been watching us from the shadows? "It was weird," Jenny finished for me. "Really weird. There was this old couch and some broken playground stuff and this really big doghouse that someone might have been living in." Aunt Patricia frowned slightly. "Living in a doghouse? Honey, I think you might have been letting your imagination run away with you." "No, really," Jenny insisted, her voice rising with frustration. "There was someone in there, and there was this creepy doll hanging from the monkey bars, and this sound coming from the trees." "What kind of sound?" my mother asked, but her tone suggested she was humoring a child's overactive imagination rather than taking the question seriously. "A whirring sound," I said, finally finding my voice. "Like machinery, but not quite. It was following us." The adults exchanged glances. The kind of look that parents give each other when they think their children are being dramatic. My father chuckled softly. "Probably just a woodpecker," he said dismissively. "They can make all sorts of strange noises." "It wasn't a woodpecker," I protested, but I could see we were fighting a losing battle. Adults had a remarkable ability to rationalize away anything that didn't fit their view of the world, and our story was too strange, too frightening for them to take seriously. Aunt Patricia reached over and felt Jenny's forehead. "You're a little warm, sweetie. Maybe the excitement got to you. Why don't we head back to the cabin and you can rest for a bit?" Jenny looked at me with frustration and defeat. We both knew we'd experienced something genuinely terrifying, but we also knew that no one was going to believe us. So we nodded and agreed that we were probably just tired, and we let them lead us out to the parking lot. As we drove away from Pine Grove Diner, I turned in my seat to look back at the restaurant. From this angle, you couldn't see the path that led into the woods, couldn't see any evidence of the horrors that waited behind that innocent-looking building. It looked exactly like what it was supposed to be, a charming mountain restaurant where families came to enjoy good food and friendly service. But I knew better now. I knew that sometimes the most ordinary places concealed the most extraordinary terrors. That was 3 years ago, and I'm 16 now. Jenny and I have never spoken about what happened that day, but sometimes I catch her looking at me with an expression that tells me she remembers everything just as clearly as I do. We've never been back to Pine Grove Diner, despite our family's occasional suggestions to return for another meal. I still have nightmares about that place. In my dreams, I'm always running down that path again, my leg cramping, that terrible whirring sound growing closer and closer. Sometimes I dream about what would have happened if we hadn't run, if we'd approached that oversized doghouse to see what was inside. Those are the worst dreams of all, because even my sleeping mind refuses to show me what we might have found in that dark space. Some fears are too great for even nightmares to contain. I don't know if that place still exists. Part of me hopes that someone has cleaned it up, removed the twisted playground equipment and that horrible hanging doll. But another part of me suspects that it's still there, waiting in the woods behind Pine Grove Diner, ready to terrify the next pair of curious children who wander down that path. And sometimes, when the wind is just right, and I'm alone in the quiet of the night, I swear I can still hear that whirring sound, carried on the mountain air from somewhere far away but not nearly far enough. It was the summer of 1995, and we were just a bunch of high school buddies, you know? The kind that had grown up in the same small town, done the same stupid things, gotten into the same kind of trouble. We were all 17, teetering on the edge of adulthood, but still clinging to the invincibility of youth. And then there was that one trip, that one hiking trip that changed everything. There were 4 of us, me, Alex, Jack, Paul, and Luke. We'd been planning this weekend hiking trip for months. Nothing fancy, just a few days out in the middle of nowhere. A remote forest up in the Appalachians, somewhere off the grid. The idea was simple: unplug, unwind, drink some beers around a fire, and maybe catch a fish or two. What we didn't know was that this place had its own secrets, old ones that had been waiting for us. We left town early on a Friday morning, packed up in Luke's dad's rusty old pickup. The drive out there took forever. 2 hours in, we lost cell service. Another hour and the road started to get narrower, more winding. The GPS cut out, but Luke swore he knew where we were going. I wasn't so sure. "Dude, are you sure this is the right way?" I asked, peering out the window at the endless sea of trees. Luke just grinned, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "Trust me, man. My cousin came out here last year. Said it was the best camping spot he'd ever found." Paul leaned forward from the back seat, his voice tinged with excitement. "Yeah. And how many times has your cousin gotten lost in his own backyard?" We all laughed, the sound echoing in the cab of the truck. It was easy to laugh then, when the world still made sense. The trailhead was nothing more than a dirt patch on the side of the road. No signs, no markers, just the start of a path disappearing into the trees. It was perfect, or so we thought. Paul cracked a joke about it being prime horror movie material, but we laughed it off. We were young, stupid, and full of energy. Nothing could touch us. As we shouldered our backpacks and started down the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The forest was quiet, too quiet. I mean, sure, forests are supposed to be peaceful, But this place? It was like the trees were listening. There was no wind, no birds, just the sound of our boots crunching through the leaves. "Hey guys," I said, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. "Is it just me, or is it really quiet out here?" Jack glanced around, his brow furrowed. Now that you mention it, yeah, it's pretty dead, weird." Luke just shrugged. "Probably just means we're the only idiots out here. More beer for us, right?" We all chuckled, but it sounded forced. Still, none of us said anything more about it. We just kept walking, pushing deeper into the forest. We set up camp just before sundown near a small creek, the kind of spot that looked untouched by humans. As the last rays of sunlight filtered through the trees, we got a fire going and cracked open our first beers. That night, the fire was warm, the beer was cold, and the conversation flowed easy. We told old stories, laughed too loud, and I swear I could hear my own voice echoing back from the woods. But again, no one mentioned it. The forest, it seemed, had a way of swallowing up the sound, making it feel like we were the only people left on Earth. "Remember that time we snuck into Old Man Johnson's orchard?" Jack said, wiping tears of laughter from his eyes. "And Paul got his pants caught on the fence." Paul groaned, but he was grinning. "Don't remind me. I still have the scar from where I ripped them off." We all howled with laughter, the sound echoing through the trees. For a moment it felt like we were back home, like this was just another night hanging out in someone's backyard. But then the laughter died down, and the silence of the forest crept back in. It was sometime around midnight when things started to feel off. Jack, always the jokester, was the first to say it. "Hey, did you guys hear that?" he asked, his voice low. We all went quiet, straining to listen. "Nothing. Dude, you're just drunk," Paul laughed. But there was a nervous edge to it. Jack wasn't convinced. "No, seriously, listen. It's like footsteps or something." I rolled my eyes, but then I heard it too. Faint, but steady, like someone or something was moving through the trees. Not close, but not far either. We brushed it off as an animal, probably a deer, maybe a bear. Luke even grabbed his flashlight and swept it through the woods, but the light didn't catch anything. We all joked about it, but the fire seemed a little less comforting after that. Eventually we called it a night, crawling into our tents with uneasy laughs and half-hearted jokes about axe murderers and Bigfoot. As I zipped up my sleeping bag, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the darkness beyond our campfire. I don't know how long I'd been asleep when I heard it. A snap, like a branch breaking underfoot. I sat up, heart racing. The fire had burned down to embers, casting long shadows around the campsite. I looked around, trying to calm myself. Everyone else was still asleep, except for Jack. His sleeping bag was empty. "Jack?" I whispered, but there was no answer. I stood up, grabbed the flashlight, and walked to the edge of the camp. I called his name again. Louder this time. Still nothing. My stomach turned with a strange mix of annoyance and worry. He was probably off taking a piss or messing with us. Typical Jack. I was about to head back to my tent when I heard it again. Footsteps slow and deliberate coming from deeper in the woods. My skin crawled. This wasn't the kind of sound an animal made. It was too measured, too intentional. I called for Jack again, louder now. This time Paul and Luke stirred awake. "What's going on?" Luke muttered, rubbing his eyes. "Jack's gone," I said, my voice tight. "I think he went into the woods." Paul sat up, his face half shadowed by the dying fire. Why the hell would he do that? Before I could answer, there was a rustling sound from the trees, followed by a sharp, almost metallic click. We all froze. It wasn't a natural sound, not from the forest. "Jack?" I called again, my voice cracking. Then suddenly, Jack appeared at the edge of the campsite, stumbling into the light. His face was pale, his eyes wide, his clothes were torn, and there was a streak of blood running down his arm. "Run," he gasped, barely able to get the word out. "Just run." None of us moved. We were too shocked, too confused. Jack collapsed to his knees, breathing hard. Before we could even process what was happening, he started sobbing, clutching his side. His shirt was soaked with blood. Luke rushed to his side, trying to pull up his shirt to see the wound. But Jack pushed him away, frantically shaking his head. No, he's out there," Jack whispered, his voice breaking. "He's coming for us." Paul and I exchanged a glance. both of us silently asking the same question. Who? Before we could ask, Jack let out a sharp, strangled cry. He pointed into the woods, his hand trembling. We all looked, and that's when we saw him. At first it was just a shape, tall, thin, almost skeletal. He stood at the edge of the light, watching us. His face, God, I'll never forget that face. It was pale, too pale, like it hadn't seen sunlight in years. His eyes were sunken, dark, but it was the smile that got me. It was wide, unnaturally wide, like it had been carved into his face. He didn't say a word. He just watched us, standing perfectly still, as if he was waiting for something. Luke was the first to snap out of it. He grabbed his backpack, fumbled for the hunting knife he always carried. "Get the hell away from us," he shouted, holding the knife out in front of him like it could actually do something. The man didn't move, didn't flinch. His eyes never left us. Jack was still shaking, mumbling something under his breath. Paul crouched down next to him, trying to calm him, but Jack wouldn't stop. He kept saying the same thing over and over. "He's not human." Luke and I were too focused on the figure in the trees to pay attention to Jack's rambling. I don't know what I was expecting, but the man didn't come closer. He just stood there, watching us. It was like he was waiting for us to make a move. And then he did something I'll never forget. Slowly, deliberately, he lifted his hand to his mouth, and with a single jerky motion, he bit into his own wrist. Blood poured from the wound, dripping down his arm, but his expression never changed. That horrible smile stayed fixed on his face. Luke and I both froze. What the hell were we dealing with? Suddenly the man turned and walked back into the trees, disappearing into the darkness as quickly as he had appeared. For a moment none of us moved. The forest was dead silent again, like nothing had happened. But we knew better. We knew he was still out there, watching. "Pack up," I said, my voice shaking. "We're leaving." Luke didn't argue. None of us did. We threw everything into our bags as quickly as we could, barely stopping to zip them up. Jack was still too weak to stand, so Paul and I helped him to his feet. We didn't even bother trying to find the trail. We just ran, crashing through the underbrush like animals. Every sound, every snap of a branch felt like it was him closing in on us. I could hear Jack's labored breathing behind me, and every now and then he'd let out a low whimper. Paul kept looking over his shoulder, like he was expecting the man to be right behind us. It felt like we ran for hours, but the forest never seemed to end. Every tree looked the same. Every turn took us deeper into nowhere. But we didn't stop, not until we saw the lights, a small cabin tucked away in the trees. The cabin looked abandoned, but we didn't care. We just needed shelter. We burst through the door, slamming it shut behind us. There was no lock, so Luke wedged a chair under the handle. We were all panting, hearts pounding in our chests. Jack collapsed onto the floor, still clutching his side. The cabin was dark, but it didn't matter. We weren't going back outside. For a long time, we just sat there, staring at the door, waiting for it to open, waiting for him to come for us. But he never did. As the adrenaline wore off, the reality of our situation started to sink in. We were lost in the middle of nowhere, with no idea which direction would lead us back to civilization. Jack was hurt, possibly seriously. And there was something out there, something that wasn't natural, wasn't human. "What the hell was that thing?" Paul whispered, breaking the silence that had fallen over us. Jack let out a low moan. It took something from me," he mumbled, his eyes unfocused. "Part of me. It's still out there." We all exchanged worried glances. Jack wasn't making sense. But after what we'd seen, who were we to say what was possible? Luke started pacing, running his hands through his hair. Okay. We need to think. We can't stay here forever. We need to find a way out." I nodded, trying to keep my voice steady. "First light. We'll wait until first light. Then we'll try to find our way back to the road." The hours crawled by. None of us slept. We took turns watching the door and the windows, jumping at every creak of the old cabin, every rustle of leaves outside. As the first light of dawn peeked through the cracks in the walls, we prepared to leave. Jack was pale, sweating, but he insisted he could walk. We didn't have much choice but to believe him. We left slowly, cautiously, making our way back in the direction we thought we'd come from. The forest looked different in the daylight, less menacing, but we knew better now. We knew what was hiding in the shadows. It took us hours, but finally, miraculously, we found the road. Luke's truck was still there, untouched. We piled in, and Luke gunned the engine, tires spinning in the dirt as we sped away from that cursed place. We never spoke about it again, not really. How could we? Who would believe us? Jack didn't come back to school. His parents said he'd gone to live with relatives out of state. But sometimes, late at night, I wonder if that's true. I wonder if part of him is still out there in those woods, with that thing. The rest of us, we tried to move on. But you don't just forget something like that. It changes you, knowing that there are things out there that can't be explained, things that shouldn't exist. Sometimes when I'm alone in the dark, I swear I can hear footsteps, slow and deliberate, and I see that smile, that impossibly wide smile, carved into a face too pale to be human. We were just a bunch of high school buddies, you know? We thought we were invincible. But that summer in those woods, we learned the truth. There are some places man was never meant to go, some secrets that should stay buried. And sometimes the monsters are real. It was late April of 2003, when I found myself in a cabin just outside of Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan. I'd come to the woods for a break from my job in Chicago, where I worked as a software engineer. I wasn't your typical city guy, though. Grew up in a small town, spent most of my teenage years hunting with my dad, and had always preferred the quiet of the outdoors to the constant noise of the city. The cabin was old, built in the 1950s, with creaky floorboards and the smell of pine and wood smoke clinging to everything. I rented it from an old friend who'd moved to California years ago and hadn't bothered to visit it since. He told me to expect some quirks. The plumbing was old, the heating unreliable, but I didn't mind. All I wanted was some time alone, to think, to breathe. As I pulled up to the cabin in my beat-up Honda Civic, the gravel crunching under the tires, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief wash over me. The past few months in Chicago had been brutal. Long hours at the office, endless meetings, and the constant pressure to meet deadlines. Here, surrounded by towering pines and the gentle lapping of Lake Superior in the distance, I felt like I could finally exhale. The cabin itself was nothing special, a simple A-frame structure with a small porch out front. The dark wood exterior had seen better days, with patches of moss growing on the north-facing side. I grabbed my duffel bag from the trunk and made my way inside, the old key turning stiffly in the lock. The interior was just as rustic as I'd expected. A small living area with a worn leather couch faced a stone fireplace. The kitchenette to the left was basic, a small fridge, a 2-burner stove, and a sink that had definitely seen better days. A narrow staircase led up to a loft area where I could see the edge of a double bed. It wasn't much, but it was exactly what I needed. I spent the first day just settling in, unpacking my groceries and the stack of books I'd brought along. There was no TV, and my phone barely had a signal, which suited me just fine. I'd brought my laptop, but I'd promised myself I wouldn't check my work email. This was about disconnecting, about reconnecting with myself and the natural world around me. That evening, I sat on the porch with a cold beer, watching the sun set through the trees. The forest came alive with the sounds of night, the hooting of an owl, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. It was peaceful, serene. I felt the tension of the past few months start to melt away. The next morning I woke early, the sunlight streaming through the small windows of the loft. After a quick breakfast of instant coffee and a granola bar, I decided to explore the area around the cabin. The air was crisp, with just a hint of the coming summer. I followed a narrow trail that wound its way through the woods, occasionally stopping to admire a particularly impressive tree or to watch a chipmunk scurry across my path. About a mile from the cabin, I came across a small stream. The water burbled over moss-covered rocks, creating a soothing white noise that seemed to wash away any lingering thoughts of work or the city. I sat on a fallen log, pulled out the paperback I'd brought along, a well-worn copy of Thoreau's Walden, and lost myself in the words and the wilderness around me. It was late afternoon by the time I made my way back to the cabin. As I approached, I noticed something odd. The door, which I was certain I'd closed, was slightly ajar. A chill ran down my spine despite the warmth of the day. I approached cautiously, straining my ears for any sound of an intruder. The cabin was empty, but things weren't quite as I'd left them. My duffel bag, which I'd left at the foot of the bed in the loft, was now on the couch. The books I'd stacked neatly on the small coffee table were scattered, some on the floor, and there on the kitchen counter was a single muddy footprint, far larger than my own. I stood there for a long moment, my heart pounding in my chest. Had someone broken in? But nothing seemed to be missing. My wallet, which I'd foolishly left on the nightstand, was untouched. My laptop was still in its bag. It didn't make sense. I considered calling the local police, but what would I tell them? That someone had come into the cabin, moved my things around, and left without taking anything. And even if I wanted to, my phone still had no signal. I was on my own. That night, I double-checked every window, every door. I even dragged the heavy wooden chair from the kitchenette and propped it under the doorknob, an old trick I'd learned from my paranoid uncle years ago. Sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the cabin settling, every rustle of wind through the trees outside, had me bolt upright, straining my ears for any sign of an intruder. The third day dawned gray and overcast, a light drizzle tapping against the roof of the cabin. I'd managed to doze off sometime in the early hours of the morning, and I woke feeling groggy and on edge. The events of the previous day felt somehow distant, like a half-remembered dream. In the light of day, I almost managed to convince myself that I'd imagined it all. The open door, the moved belongings, the muddy footprint. Almost. I spent most of the day inside, alternating between reading and staring out the window at the misty woods beyond. As evening approached, the rain let up, and I decided to step out onto the porch for some fresh air. The forest was eerily quiet, the usual chorus of birds and insects muted by the recent rainfall. That's when I heard it. A crash in the woods. Like something heavy falling or being thrown. At first I thought it might be a tree limb, weakened by the rain and finally giving way. But then I heard it again. Closer this time. And again, closer still. Whatever was making the noise, it was big. Much bigger than any deer or bear I'd encountered in my years of hunting. And it was moving with purpose, heading straight for the cabin. I hurried inside, my heart racing. I grabbed the hunting knife I'd brought along, more out of habit than any expectation of needing it, and stood by the window, peering out into the gathering darkness. For a long moment there was nothing. Just the soft patter of raindrops on leaves, and the pounding of my own heart in my ears. Then, at the edge of the clearing, something moved. At first I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. It was like my brain couldn't process the information my eyes were sending it. The shape was all wrong. Too big to be a bear. Too misshapen to be any animal I'd ever encountered. It moved on all fours, but its gait was uneven, almost lurching. And its eyes, God, its eyes. They reflected the faint porch light like twin flames in the darkness. I stood there frozen, as the thing made its way across the clearing towards the cabin. It moved slowly, almost cautiously, its massive head swinging from side to side as if scenting the air. As it got closer, I could make out more details, each one more horrifying than the last. Its body was covered in a thick, matted fur, but patches were missing, revealing skin that looked wrong. Too smooth in some places, ridged and scarred in others. Its front limbs ended in massive curved claws that dug into the soft earth with each step. But it was the face that truly chilled me to my core. It was like someone had tried to create a bear from description alone, and gotten everything subtly, terrifyingly wrong. The snout was too long, the teeth too numerous and sharp, and those eyes, they held an intelligence that no animal should possess. The creature stopped about 20 feet from the cabin, its head raised, staring directly at me through the window. I don't know how long we stood there, locked in that moment. It could have been seconds or hours. Then, slowly, deliberately, it opened its mouth. What came out wasn't a roar or a growl. It was a sound I'd never heard before and hope never to hear again. A low guttural noise that seemed to vibrate in my very bones. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it turned and lumbered back into the woods, leaving nothing but massive, misshapen footprints in the muddy ground. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the old armchair, my hunting knife in one hand, a flashlight in the other, jumping at every sound. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, I made a decision. I was leaving. Whatever that thing was, whatever was happening in these woods, I wanted no part of it. I threw my belongings haphazardly into my duffel bag, not bothering to fold anything. As I was loading up my car, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There, in the mud by the porch steps, was a single footprint. It matched the ones I'd seen the creature leave the night before. But this one was facing the cabin, not away from it. The thing had come right up to the porch while I was inside. I got in my car and drove, not even bothering to lock up the cabin behind me. As I sped down the gravel road leading back to civilization, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that somewhere in those dark woods that thing was following my progress, those unnatural eyes tracking my escape. I've never told anyone the full story of what happened in those woods outside Sault Ste. Marie. Who would believe me? Sometimes. Late at night, I managed to convince myself that it was all a dream, a hallucination brought on by stress and isolation. But then I'll catch a glimpse of something moving just at the edge of my vision, or I'll wake up in a cold sweat, the echo of that unearthly sound ringing in my ears. I don't go camping anymore. I've turned down every invitation to cabins or hiking trips. I tell people I've developed allergies, or that I'm too busy with work. The truth is, I'm afraid. Afraid that if I go back to the woods, I'll see that thing again. And afraid that this time, it won't just watch from a distance. Sometimes when the wind blows just right, and carries with it the scent of pine and damp earth, I find myself wondering, is it still out there, in those Michigan woods? Is it waiting? And if it is, what exactly is it waiting for? The incessant honking of car horns and the relentless chatter of millions of voices had finally taken their toll on me. As I sat in my cramped studio apartment in downtown Seattle, staring at the glowing screen of my laptop, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was slowly suffocating under the weight of urban life. The walls seemed to close in around me, a metaphorical representation of the stress that had been building up over months of grueling work and sleepless nights. It was in this state of near desperation that I remembered a conversation I'd had with my coworker, Sarah. A few weeks earlier, she had returned from a long weekend looking refreshed and rejuvenated, her eyes sparkling with a vitality I hadn't seen in her for months. "You wouldn't believe how amazing it was, Alex," she had gushed, leaning over my cubicle wall. "This little town in Oregon, nestled right in the heart of the most beautiful forest you've ever seen. Whispering Pines, they call it. It's like stepping into another world." At the time, I had nodded politely, only half listening as I tried to focus on the mountain of work piling up on my desk. But now, as I sat in my apartment feeling the walls of my urban prison closing in, Sarah's words came back to me with startling clarity. Without giving myself time to second-guess the decision, I opened my browser and began searching for information on Whispering Pines. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for: a quaint bed and breakfast on the outskirts of town, promising a tranquil retreat from the hustle and bustle of city life. The photos showed a charming wooden structure surrounded by towering pines, their branches reaching toward a sky so blue it almost looked unreal. I didn't hesitate. Within minutes I had booked a room for an extended weekend in September, when I knew the summer crowds would have thinned out but the weather would still be pleasant. As I clicked the confirm reservation button, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. For the first time in months I had something to look forward to. A chance to escape, to breathe, to remember what it felt like to exist without the constant pressure of deadlines and expectations. The weeks leading up to my trip passed in a blur of anticipation. I found myself daydreaming about long hikes through sun-dappled forests, evenings spent reading by a crackling fireplace, and mornings waking up to the sound of birdsong instead of blaring car alarms. By the time September rolled around, I was more than ready for my adventure. The drive from Seattle to Whispering Pines took about 5 hours, but it felt like a journey to another world. As I left the city behind, the landscape gradually transformed. Towering skyscrapers gave way to rolling hills, which in turn yielded to dense forests of pine and fir. The air grew cleaner, crisper, filled with the scent of evergreens and wild herbs. It was late afternoon when I finally turned onto the narrow road leading into Whispering Pines. The town itself was smaller than I had imagined, a collection of rustic buildings clustered around a quaint main street. As I drove slowly through, I noticed a few locals going about their business, offering friendly waves as I passed. The bed and breakfast, Pinecrest Lodge, was exactly as it had appeared in the photos. A large 2-story log cabin set back from the road, surrounded by a sea of green. As I pulled into the gravel driveway, the front door opened, and a woman stepped out onto the porch. "You must be Alex," she called, her voice warm and welcoming. "I'm Martha. We've been expecting you." I climbed out of my car, stretching my legs after the long drive. "It's nice to meet you, Martha. This place is beautiful." Martha beamed with pride. "Thank you, dear. We do our best to keep it that way. Come on in, and I'll show you to your room. You must be tired after your journey." As I followed Martha into the lodge, I couldn't help but feel a sense of peace wash over me. The interior was just as charming as the exterior, with polished wooden floors, comfortable-looking furniture, and a large stone fireplace dominating one wall of the common area. My room was on the second floor, a cozy space with a queen-sized bed, a writing desk by the window, and a small and sweet bathroom. But it was the view that took my breath away. The window overlooked the forest, an endless expanse of green stretching as far as the eye could see. "Dinner's at 7 if you'd like to join us," Martha said as she handed me the key. "We've got a few other guests staying, and it's always nice to share a meal and get to know each other." I thanked her and promised to be down for dinner. As soon as she left, I flopped onto the bed, feeling the tension of the past few months begin to melt away. The quiet was almost startling after so long in the city. No traffic noise, no sirens, just the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, the light had changed, taking on the golden hue of early evening. A glance at my watch told me it was nearly 7, so I quickly freshened up and made my way downstairs. The dining room was a warm, inviting space with a large oak table that could easily seat a dozen people. Martha was bustling about, setting out plates and cutlery, while a man I assumed was her husband was bringing in steaming dishes from the kitchen. "Ah, Alex," Martha smiled as she saw me. Come in. Let me introduce you to our other guests." There were 4 other people already seated at the table. An elderly couple, introduced as the Johnsons, who were celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary with a trip through the Pacific Northwest. A middle-aged woman named Linda, an artist from Portland who had come to Whispering Pines for inspiration. And finally, a man about my age named Tom, who, like me, had come seeking a break from city life. As we ate, a delicious meal of roast chicken, vegetables from Martha's garden, and homemade apple pie for dessert, conversation flowed easily. The Johnsons regaled us with stories from their long marriage. Linda spoke passionately about her art, and Tom and I compared notes on our respective city lives and what had brought us to this quiet corner of Oregon. It was well past 10 by the time we finished our meal and retired to our rooms. As I lay in bed that night, listening to the gentle whisper of the wind through the pines, I felt more relaxed than I had in years. Little did I know that this sense of peace was about to be shattered in the most horrifying way imaginable. The next few days passed in a blissful haze of relaxation and exploration. Each morning, I woke to the sound of birdsong and the smell of fresh coffee wafting up from the kitchen. After a hearty breakfast shared with the other guests, I would set out to explore the town and its surroundings. Whispering Pines, I discovered, was a place that seemed to exist in a bubble, untouched by the frantic pace of the outside world. The locals were friendly and unhurried, always ready with a smile or a bit of local gossip. I spent hours wandering the main street, browsing the small shops that sold everything from handmade crafts to homemade jams and jellies. One of my favorite discoveries was a tiny bookstore tucked away on a side street. The owner, a jovial man in his 60s named Frank, seemed to know every book in his shop intimately. We spent a pleasant afternoon discussing literature, and I left with a stack of books to keep me company during my stay. But it was the natural beauty surrounding Whispering Pines that truly captured my heart. The forest was a wonderland of towering trees, babbling brooks and hidden meadows bursting with wildflowers. I spent hours hiking the well-maintained trails, drinking in the peace and serenity of the wilderness. On my 3rd day, I met Bernard, a local hunter and nature guide. I had stopped to catch my breath at a scenic overlook when he appeared beside me, moving so quietly through the forest that I hadn't heard him approach. "Beautiful view, isn't it?" he said, startling me out of my reverie. I turned to find a man in his late 50s, with weathered features and keen eyes that seemed to take in everything around us. He introduced himself as Bernard, and upon learning that I was a visitor, offered to show me some of the less well-known trails. Over the next couple of days, Bernard became my unofficial guide to the wilderness around Whispering Pines. He was a wealth of knowledge about the local flora and fauna, pointing out plants I would have overlooked and teaching me to recognize animal tracks. "You've got to respect the forest," he told me, as we rested by a crystal-clear stream on our second hike together. "It's beautiful, sure, but it can be dangerous if you're not careful." Always be aware of your surroundings, and never underestimate the wild. I nodded, absorbing his words. At the time, I thought he was just being cautious, warning a city dweller about the usual dangers of the wilderness. Getting lost, encountering a bear, that sort of thing. I had no idea how prophetic his warning would prove to be. As the days passed, I felt myself unwinding, the stress and tension of city life melting away like morning mist under the warm sun. I slept better than I had in years, lulled to sleep each night by the gentle whisper of wind through the pines. My dreams were filled with images of sunlit glades and starry skies, unsullied by the harsh glare of city lights. It wasn't until my fourth day in Whispering Pines that the first hints of unease began to creep in. I had decided to take a solo hike that afternoon, feeling confident enough in my newfound wilderness skills to venture out on my own. The day was perfect. Warm sunshine, a gentle breeze, and a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at. I set out after lunch, my backpack loaded with water, snacks, and my camera. The trail I had chosen was one Bernard had mentioned but hadn't shown me yet. A bit more challenging than the others, he'd said, but with some spectacular views if you were willing to put in the effort. For the first couple of hours, the hike was everything I had hoped for. The trail wound through dense forest, occasionally opening up to reveal breathtaking vistas of the surrounding mountains. I took my time, stopping often to snap photos or simply to stand in awe of the natural beauty around me. It was late afternoon when I reached a particularly picturesque spot. The trail had emerged from the forest into a small clearing, offering a panoramic view of the valley below. I paused to catch my breath and take a few photos, marveling at how the setting sun painted the landscape in hues of gold and amber. As I lowered my camera, something caught my eye at the edge of the clearing. At first, I thought it was just a pile of leaves or debris blown there by the wind. But as I looked closer, a chill ran down my spine. What I had mistaken for forest detritus was actually a heap of tattered clothing. Curiosity overrode my initial sense of unease, and I approached the pile cautiously. As I drew closer, the true horror of what I was seeing began to dawn on me. The clothing was not just tattered, it was shredded, as if something had torn at it with incredible force. And surrounding the torn fabric was a dark stain that I realized, with a sickening lurch in my stomach, was dried blood. My hand shaking, I reached out to touch the fabric, only to recoil in horror as my fingers brushed against something hard and white beneath the cloth. With a rising sense of panic, I realized I was looking at bones, human bones, picked clean and partially crushed. The peaceful serenity of the forest suddenly seemed oppressive, the lengthening shadows taking on a menacing quality. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. What kind of animal could have done this? A bear, perhaps. But even as I thought it, I knew that this was no ordinary animal attack. The violence of the scene before me spoke of a savagery that went beyond simple predation. My first instinct was to call for help. But as I fumbled for my phone, I realized with growing dread that I had no signal. I was alone in the wilderness, miles from town, with night falling and the evidence of some horrific tragedy at my feet. Panic threatened to overwhelm me, but I forced myself to take deep breaths, trying to think rationally. I needed to get back to town, to report what I had found. But the thought of navigating the trail in the growing darkness filled me with terror. What if whatever had done this was still out there, waiting in the shadows? With one last horrified glance at the grisly scene, I turned and began to make my way back down the trail as quickly as I dared. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves sent a jolt of fear through me. The forest, which had seemed so welcoming just hours before, now felt oppressive and threatening. It was fully dark by the time I stumbled back into town, my clothes torn from my headlong rush through the underbrush, my face scratched and my lungs burning. I made my way directly to the small police station, bursting through the door and startling the lone officer on duty. "Whoa there, son," the officer said, rising from his desk with a concerned look. "What's got you in such a state?" Between gasps for breath, I managed to relay what I had found. The officer, a middle-aged man named Deputy Collins, listened with growing concern. He asked me to repeat certain details, his frown deepening with each retelling. "Are you sure about what you saw?" he asked finally. "It's easy for the mind to play tricks, especially as it's getting dark out there." I insisted that I knew what I had seen. The image of those shredded clothes and bleached bones burned into my memory. Deputy Collins sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "All right," he said at last. I'll send a team out first thing in the morning to check it out. In the meantime, I'm going to need you to stay in town. We may have more questions for you." As I left the police station, I felt a mix of relief at having reported my grisly discovery and frustration at the deputy's apparent lack of urgency. Didn't he understand the implications of what I had found? There could be a dangerous animal, or something worse, out there in the woods. I made my way back to Pinecrest Lodge in a daze, the events of the afternoon replaying in my mind. Martha met me at the door, her usual cheerful expression replaced by one of concern. "Alex, dear, what happened to you?" she asked, taking in my disheveled appearance. I hesitated, unsure of how much to say. I didn't want to cause a panic, but I also felt that people needed to be warned. In the end, I gave her abbreviated version of events, leaving out the more gruesome details. Martha listened with growing alarm. "Oh my," she said when I had finished. "I've never heard of anything like that happening around here before. Are you sure you're all right? You look like you could use a good meal and some rest." I assured her that I was fine, just shaken up, and made my way up to my room. But as I lay in bed that night, sleep eluded me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those tattered clothes, those bleached bones, and in the darkness of my room, my imagination conjured up terrifying images of what might be lurking out there in the woods. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of a nightmare that would shake Whispering Pines to its very foundations. Sleep, when it finally came, was fitful and filled with unsettling dreams. I tossed and turned, my subconscious mind replaying the gruesome scene I had stumbled upon, embellishing it with terrifying details born of my fears and imagination. In my dreams, shadows moved at the edge of my vision, always just out of sight, and inhuman howls echoed through the forest. I woke with a start, my heart pounding and my sheets damp with sweat. For a moment I was disoriented, the lingering tendrils of my nightmares making the familiar contours of my room at Pinecrest Lodge seem alien and threatening. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through the curtains, I realized it was early morning, the sky outside just beginning to lighten with the promise of dawn. Knowing that sleep would elude me now, I decided to get up and face the day. As I showered and dressed, I tried to shake off the lingering unease from my dreams, telling myself that in the light of day things would seem less ominous. Yet I couldn't quite dispel the memory of what I had seen in the forest. When I made my way downstairs, I found Martha already in the kitchen, preparing breakfast. The smell of coffee and bacon filled the air, a comforting normalcy that helped to ground me. "Good morning, Alex," Martha greeted me, her usual cheerful smile tinged with concern. "You're up early. Did you sleep all right?" I mumbled something non-committal, not wanting to worry her further. As I sipped my coffee, Martha bustled about the kitchen, her constant movement and chatter creating a soothing backdrop. Gradually, I felt some of the tension from the night before begin to ease. It wasn't long before the other guests began to filter in, drawn by the promise of Martha's cooking. Tom, the other city dweller, took a seat next to me at the table. "Rough night?" he asked, eyeing the dark circles under my eyes. I hesitated, then decided to confide in him. In a low voice, I recounted my experience from the day before, watching as Tom's expression shifted from curiosity to disbelief to growing concern. "That's intense," he said when I had finished. "Are you sure about what you saw? I mean, it could have been an animal attack, right?" I shook my head. "You didn't see it, Tom. This was something else. Something worse." Our conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Deputy Collins. He entered the dining room with a grim expression, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on me. "Mr. Hamilton," he said, approaching our table, "I'm going to need you to come down to the station. We've got some questions about your discovery yesterday." A hush fell over the room as the other guests turned to stare. I could feel their curious gazes on my back as I followed Deputy Collins out to his patrol car. The ride to the police station was tense and silent. Deputy Collins seemed lost in thought, his usual affable demeanor replaced by a worried frown. When we arrived, he led me to a small interview room and closed the door behind us. "All right, Mr. Hamilton," he said, taking a seat across from me. "I need you to tell me everything you saw yesterday. Every detail, no matter how small or insignificant it might seem." For the next hour, I recounted my experience, describing the scene in the clearing with as much detail as I could remember. Deputy Collins listened intently, occasionally interrupting to ask for clarification or additional details. When I had finished, he leaned back in his chair with a heavy sigh. "We sent a team out to the location you described this morning. he said. They found, well, they found evidence that corroborates your story. A chill ran down my spine. What kind of evidence? I asked. Not sure I wanted to know the answer. Deputy Collins hesitated, then seemed to come to a decision. I'm going to level with you, Mr. Hamilton. We found blood, a lot of it, and remains. Human remains. But by the time we got there, most of the evidence had been disturbed. Tracks all around the area, but nothing we could make sense of. It's like nothing I've ever seen before. The implications of what he was saying hit me like a physical blow. So you believe me? About it not being a normal animal attack? I don't know what to believe, Deputy Collins admitted. But I know something's not right. We've called in help from the state police, but until they arrive, we're keeping this quiet. Don't want to cause a panic. As I left the police station, my mind was reeling. The official acknowledgement of what I had seen somehow made it more real, more terrifying. The peaceful facade of Whispering Pines suddenly seemed fragile, a thin veneer hiding something dark and dangerous. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I wandered the streets of the town, seeing it with new eyes. The friendly smiles of the locals now seemed strained, hiding worry or fear. Or was I just projecting my own unease onto them? As evening approached, I found myself drawn to the local bar, seeking some form of distraction or comfort. The place was busier than I had seen it before, a low murmur of conversation filling the air. I took a seat at the bar, ordered a whiskey, and tried to lose myself in the ambient noise. It was there that I overheard a conversation that made my blood run cold. Two men, locals by the sound of their accents, were talking in low voices at the end of the bar. Third one this year. One of them was saying, "Can't be a coincidence." "Shh," the other man hissed. "We don't talk about that. You know the rules." "Rules be damned," the first man retorted. "People are dying. We can't just ignore it." "And what would you have us do? You know what happened last time someone tried to..." Their voices dropped even lower, and I couldn't make out the rest of the conversation. But what I had heard was enough to send a chill down my spine. Third one this year. Were there other incidents, like what I had witnessed? And why was everyone so intent on keeping it quiet? As I made my way back to Pinecrest Lodge that night, the streets of Whispering Pines seemed darker, the shadows deeper. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig made me jump. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was out there in the darkness, waiting. Back in my room, I double-checked the lock on my door and drew the curtains tight. But as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I knew that sleep would be a long time coming. The peaceful retreat I had sought had turned into something far more sinister, and I was beginning to fear that I had stumbled into a nightmare from which there might be no easy escape. The next morning dawned gray and overcast, matching my mood perfectly. I had managed to snatch a few hours of restless sleep, but my dreams had been plagued by shapeless terrors, and the sound of inhuman howls echoing through endless forests. As I made my way downstairs, I could feel the tension in the air. The other guests were subdued, speaking in hushed tones that fell silent as I entered the room. News of my discovery had clearly spread, and I could see the mixture of curiosity and fear in their eyes as they glanced my way. Martha bustled about, trying to maintain an air of normalcy, but I could see the strain in her smile, the worry lines etched more deeply around her eyes. As she set a plate of eggs and toast in front of me, she leaned in close. "Bernard's asking for you," she murmured. "Says he needs to talk to you. Urgent-like." I nodded, my appetite suddenly gone. Bernard, the seasoned hunter who had shown me the trails, might have some insights into what was happening. At the very least, he knew these woods better than anyone. After choking down a few bites of breakfast, I made my way to Bernard's cabin on the outskirts of town. The old hunter was waiting for me on his porch, a rifle cradled in his arms and a grim expression on his weathered face. "Took you long enough," he growled as I approached. "Come on inside. We need to talk." Bernard's cabin was a cluttered space, every surface covered with hunting trophies, old books, and various tools of his trade. He gestured for me to take a seat while he paced the room, his agitation palpable. "I heard about what you found," he said finally, coming to a stop in front of me. "And I think it's time you knew the truth about Whispering Pines." Over the next hour, Bernard spun a tale that seemed too fantastic, too horrifying to be true. But as he spoke, pieces began to fall into place, and a terrifying picture emerged. According to Bernard, the forests around Whispering Pines had always been home to something. something ancient and malevolent. The indigenous people who had lived in these lands long before the town was founded had legends of shape-shifting creatures that hunted in the deep woods, taking on the form of their prey to lure them to their doom. When the first settlers came here, Bernard continued, his voice low and intense, they thought the stories were just superstition, but then people started disappearing. Hunters would go out into the woods and never return. Children would vanish from their beds in the night. The town had tried to fight back, organizing hunting parties to track down whatever was plaguing them, but they were woefully unprepared for what they found. It was a massacre, Bernard said, his eyes haunted by the memory. Those that survived, well, they came to an understanding with the creatures, a pact of sorts. The terms of this pact, as Bernard explained them, turned my stomach. The town would turn a blind eye to occasional disappearances, write them off as tragic accidents or animal attacks. In return, the creatures would limit their hunting, would not attack the town directly. But lately, Bernard said, his voice dropping to a whisper, something's changed. The attacks are becoming more frequent, more brazen. What you saw out there, that's just the beginning. As Bernard's tale came to an end, I sat in stunned silence, trying to process what I had heard. Part of me wanted to dismiss it as the ramblings of a superstitious old man, but after what I had seen, could I really afford to disbelieve him? Why are you telling me this? I asked finally. Bernard's eyes met mine, filled with a mixture of fear and determination. Because you've seen them now. You're a part of this whether you want to be or not. And because I think you might be able to help us end this, once and for all. Before I could ask what he meant, a piercing scream shattered the quiet of the afternoon. Bernard was on his feet in an instant, grabbing his rifle. It's starting, he said grimly. They're coming out of the woods. As we rushed out of the cabin, the peaceful facade of whispering pines was crumbling around us. In the distance, I could see shapes moving at the edge of the forest, shapes that seemed to shift and change as I watched. The air was filled with screams and the sound of breaking glass. Bernard pressed a handgun into my palm, the metal cold and unfamiliar in my grip. Stay close, he ordered, and whatever you do, don't let them touch you. As we made our way towards the center of town, the true horror of what was unfolding became clear. The creatures Bernard had spoken of were real, and they were attacking the town with a savagery that defied belief. I caught glimpses of them as we moved, grotesque, shifting forms that seemed to be a nightmarish blend of human and animal characteristics. Townspeople ran in panic, while others barricaded themselves in buildings. I saw Deputy Collins organizing a group of armed men, trying to mount some kind of defense, but against these creatures, conventional weapons seemed to have little effect. We need to get to the old church, Bernard shouted over the chaos. There's something there that might help us. As we fought our way through the panicked crowds, I couldn't help but wonder what I had gotten myself into. This peaceful Oregon town had become a war zone, and I was caught in the middle of a conflict I barely understood. But as I followed Bernard towards whatever salvation he thought we might find, one thing was clear. The whispering pines I had come to for a relaxing getaway was gone. In its place was a nightmare beyond anything I could have imagined, and survival was far from guaranteed. The old church Bernard spoke of stood on a hill overlooking the town, its weathered spire reaching towards the sky like a finger pointing accusingly at the heavens. As we made our way up the winding path, the sounds of chaos from the town below grew fainter, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to press in on us from all sides. Bernard led the way, his rifle at the ready, every line of his body taut with tension. I followed close behind, the unfamiliar weight of the handgun a constant reminder of the danger we were in. My heart pounded in my chest, and every rustle of leaves or snapping twig made me flinch, expecting to see one of those monstrous shapes lunging at us from the undergrowth. What exactly are we looking for? I whispered as we approached the church. Bernard's response was terse. A weapon. Something the first settlers brought with them. Something that can hurt these creatures. The church door creaked ominously as Bernard pushed it open, the sound echoing in the still air. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of dust and decay. Weak light filtered through grimy stained glass windows, casting multicolored shadows across the floor. As my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I saw that the interior of the church was in a state of advanced decay. Pews lay overturned, their wood rotting and split. The altar at the far end was covered in a thick layer of dust, and cobwebs hung like funeral shrouds from every corner. Bernard moved purposefully towards the altar, his eyes scanning the floor. "It should be here somewhere," he muttered. "A trapdoor, ah." With a grunt of effort, he shoved aside a fallen piece of masonry, revealing a small, iron-bound door set into the floor. The lock had long since rusted away, and it took both of us to heave the door open, revealing a narrow stone staircase descending into darkness. "Down there?" I asked, unable to keep the tremor from my voice. Bernard nodded grimly. "Down there. Stay close, and keep your eyes open. No telling what might be waiting for us." The stairs seemed to go on forever, spiraling down into the earth. The air grew colder as we descended, and I could hear the soft drip of water echoing from somewhere in the darkness. Finally, the stairs opened out into a large circular chamber. As Bernard's flashlight swept the room, I gasped. The walls were covered in intricate carvings, depicting scenes of violence and horror. I saw representations of the creatures we had encountered, shown in various stages of transformation, and everywhere, images of death and suffering. But it was what stood in the center of the room that truly caught my attention. On a raised dais stood a pedestal, and on that pedestal rested a sword. It was unlike any weapon I had ever seen, its blade seeming to shimmer and shift in the beam of the flashlight as if it couldn't quite decide what shape it wanted to be. "That's it," Bernard breathed, a note of awe in his voice. "The weapon that can end this nightmare." As Bernard reached for the sword, a low growl echoed through the chamber. We spun around to see one of the creatures crouched in the doorway, its form rippling and changing as it prepared to attack. What followed was a blur of violence and terror. Bernard moved with a speed that belied his age, snatching up the sword and meeting the creature's charge. The blade seemed to come alive in his hands, leaving trails of silver light in the air as it sliced through the monster's shifting flesh. I stood frozen, the gun forgotten in my hand, as Bernard and the creature engaged in a deadly dance. The old hunter was holding his own, but I could see that he was tiring. With each passing moment, the creature's attacks grew closer to finding their mark. In that moment, something snapped inside me. The fear and confusion of the past few days crystallized into a burning determination. I raised the gun, took careful aim, and squeezed the trigger. The report of the gunshot was deafening in the confined space. My shot went wide, but it was enough to distract the creature for a crucial moment. Bernard seized the opportunity, driving the mystical sword deep into the monster's writhing form. There was a sound like reality itself tearing apart, and the creature dissolved into a cloud of foul-smelling mist. As the last wisps faded away, Bernard stumbled back, leaning heavily on the sword. "Good shot, kid," he panted. "Thought I was done for there." But our victory was short-lived. From above, we could hear the sounds of more creatures entering the church. The scrape of claws on stone and inhuman growls echoed down the stairwell, growing louder with each passing second. "We need to get out of here," Bernard growled, hefting the sword. "This isn't the place to make our stand." I nodded, my mouth too dry to speak. We made our way to the stairs, Bernard taking the lead with the mystical sword at the ready. As we ascended, the sounds of the creatures grew louder, more frenzied. It was clear they knew we were there, and they were coming for us. We burst out of the trapdoor into the main body of the church, only to find ourselves surrounded. At least half a dozen of the monstrous beings had us cornered, their forms shifting and writhing in the dim light filtering through the stained glass windows. What followed was a nightmare of violence and terror. Bernard was a whirlwind of motion, the mystical sword leaving trails of silver light as it cut through the air. I did what I could with the handgun, my shots more often serving as a distraction than doing any real damage. But for every creature we took down, it seemed two more took its place. We were being overwhelmed, and both Bernard and I were tiring rapidly. Just as it seemed all hope was lost, a thunderous boom shook the church to its foundations. Through the shattered remains of the church's main doors strode Deputy Collins, leading a group of townsfolk armed with an assortment of weapons. The cavalry had arrived, and not a moment too soon. "Get down," Collins bellowed, and I hit the floor just as a barrage of gunfire erupted around us. The creatures, caught between Bernard's mystical sword and the onslaught of bullets, began to fall. Those that could fled, their inhuman shrieks of rage and pain fading into the distance. As the dust settled, I struggled to my feet, my ears ringing from the gunfire. Bernard stood in the center of the church, the sword glowing faintly in his grip, surrounded by the dissipating remains of the creatures we had fought. "It's not over," he said grimly, his eyes meeting mine. This was just the first wave. We need to end this once and for all. Over the next few hours, as the sun began to set, we fortified the church as best we could. The townsfolk, now fully aware of the threat they faced, worked tirelessly under Bernard and Deputy Collins' direction. Windows were boarded up, makeshift barricades were erected, and everyone who could hold a weapon was armed. I found myself in the thick of it all, moving from group to group, helping where I could and trying to boost morale. The terror of the day's events had left its mark on everyone, but there was a grim determination in the eyes of the townspeople. They had lived under the shadow of this threat for generations, and now that it was out in the open, they were ready to fight. As night fell, an unnatural silence descended over Whispering Pines. The forest seemed to press in around us, the darkness between the trees alive with malevolent intent. We gathered in the church, a small army of frightened but resolute individuals, waiting for the attack we knew was coming. Bernard stood at the front of the church, the mystical sword gleaming in the flickering candlelight. He had spent the last hour explaining to everyone what we were up against, sharing the secret history of Whispering Pines that had been hidden for so long. "These creatures," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "They're not just animals, they're not just monsters. They're a corruption of nature itself, a cancer that's been growing in these woods for centuries. But tonight we have a chance to end it." He held up the sword, its blade seeming to drink in the light around it. This weapon was forged to fight these abominations. It can hurt them, kill them in a way nothing else can, but it needs to strike at the heart of their power. A murmur ran through the crowd. Deputy Collins stepped forward, his face etched with concern. "What do you mean, Bernard? Where is this heart?" Bernard's eyes met mine, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I knew what he was going to say before the words left his mouth. "The clearing," I said, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. "Where I found the remains. That's it, isn't it?" Bernard nodded grimly. "It's their nexus, the source of their power in this world. If we can get there, if we can use the sword at the center of that clearing, we can end this nightmare once and for all." A heavy silence fell over the church as the implications of Bernard's words sank in. What he was proposing was nothing short of a suicide mission, a push into the heart of enemy territory. To my own surprise, I found myself stepping forward. "I'll go," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I found it once, I can find it again." Bernard's weathered face broke into a grim smile. "I was hoping you'd say that, kid, but you're not going alone. I'm coming with you." Others began to volunteer. Deputy Collins, Tom from the lodge, and a handful of the braver townsfolk. As we began to plan our assault, the first howls of the night split the air outside. The battle for Whispering Pines had begun. What followed was a night of terror and heroism that I will never forget. The creatures came in waves, throwing themselves against our defenses with mindless ferocity. The air was filled with the crack of gunfire, the screams of the wounded, and the inhuman shrieks of our attackers. Through it all, our small strike team fought our way out of the church and into the woods. Bernard led the way, the mystical sword cutting a path through any creature that dared to come close. I was right behind him, my borrowed gun long since emptied, now armed with a makeshift spear. The forest seemed to come alive around us, branches reaching out to snag our clothes, roots rising to trip our feet. More than once we lost members of our team to the shadows, their screams quickly cut short. By the time we reached the clearing, our group had been whittled down to just 4, Bernard, Deputy Collins, Tom, and myself. The sight that greeted us there will haunt me for the rest of my days. The clearing was transformed. Where before there had been only forest floor and scattered leaves, now there was a pulsing organic mass that covered every inch of ground. It writhed and pulsated, and at its center, a pillar of darkness rose into the sky, seeming to drink in all light around it. Surrounding this abomination were dozens of the creatures. All turned towards us as we burst into the clearing. For a moment, everything was still, as if the very air was holding its breath. Then Bernard let out a battle cry that seemed to shake the trees themselves, and charged towards the central pillar, the sword held high. The clearing exploded into chaos. The creatures swarmed towards us, their forms shifting and changing as they attacked. Deputy Collins and Tom fought back to back, their weapons a blur as they held off the horde. I found myself face to face with one of the larger creatures, its body a nightmarish blend of bear and something decidedly not of this world. as its claws raked across my chest, sending waves of burning pain through my body. I drove my spear deep into its shifting mass. The creature let out a shriek that seemed to pierce my very soul before dissolving into mist. Through the melee, I caught glimpses of Bernard fighting his way towards the central pillar. The sword in his hands blazed with an inner light, each swing leaving trails of fire in the air. But the creatures were endless, and I could see that the old hunter's strength was fading. In that moment, I knew what I had to do. Ignoring the pain of my wounds, I fought my way towards Bernard. "The sword!" I shouted over the din of battle. "Bernard, give me the sword!" His eyes met mine, and I saw understanding flash across his face. With a final burst of strength, he cut down the creatures between us and tossed the sword through the air. I caught it by the hilt, feeling a surge of power course through my body. The sword seemed to come alive in my hands, its weight perfect, its balance flawless. With a cry that came from some primal part of my being, I charged towards the pillar of darkness. The world seemed to slow down around me. I was aware of everything: the creatures lunging at me, the cries of my companions, the pulse of the corrupt earth beneath my feet, but none of it mattered. All that existed was the sword in my hands and the pillar of darkness before me. With a final leap, I plunged the sword into the heart of the darkness. There was a moment of absolute silence, as if the entire world had taken a collective breath. Then, reality itself seemed to tear apart. A shockwave of pure force exploded outward from the sword, sending me flying backwards. The creatures around us let out a collective shriek of agony before dissolving into mist. The pulsing mass on the ground withered and died, crumbling to ash. As I struggled to my feet, I saw the pillar of darkness collapse in on itself, imploding with a sound like the death cry of a dying god. Then silence fell over the clearing. It was over. We had won. The days that followed were a blur of recovery and reconstruction. The toll on Whispering Pines had been severe. Many lives had been lost and much of the town lay in ruins. But as we worked to rebuild, there was a sense of hope that I hadn't felt before. The shadow that had hung over this place for generations was finally lifted. Bernard, despite his wounds, threw himself into the reconstruction efforts. "This town's got a chance to start over," he told me one evening as we sat on the porch of his cabin, looking out over the forest, "to be what it always should have been, without that darkness hanging over it." As for me, I found that I couldn't bring myself to leave. The quiet Oregon town I had come to for a relaxing getaway had changed me in ways I was only beginning to understand. The mystical sword, its purpose fulfilled, had crumbled to dust after that final battle, but I could still feel its power within me, a reminder of the thin line between our world and the realms of darkness that lie just out of sight. Whispering Pines would rebuild. It would heal, and I would be there to see it happen, to help in whatever way I could. The forest that had once held such terror now felt like home, and I knew that whatever darkness might still lurk in the shadows of this world, there would always be those willing to stand against it. As I sit here now, writing down this account of the incredible events that transpired in that small Oregon town, I can't help but look out my window at the pine trees swaying in the breeze. They whisper their secrets to the wind, but now, those whispers no longer fill me with dread. Instead, they remind me of the strength we found within ourselves when faced with unimaginable horror, and the light that can be kindled even in the darkest of places. The shadows may never truly be gone from Whispering Pines, but neither will those who stand ready to face them, and in that knowledge I find a peace I never thought possible in the wake of such terror. Libby Creek runs quietly through the Kootenai National Forest in northwest Montana, about 30 minutes south of the sleepy town of Libby. The area draws locals for recreational gold panning, but remains far enough off the beaten path that tourists rarely venture here. Ryan and I weren't locals. We'd driven across the border from Idaho on a spontaneous summer road trip in July of 2022, planning to hike, explore, and maybe try gold panning as a relaxing hobby. We arrived at Libby Creek around 7 in the evening on July 3rd. The temperature had dropped to a comfortable 72 degrees, and the area felt peaceful, almost deserted. I was 26 then, Ryan 28, both of us eager to escape the suffocating heat of Boise. Parking our Subaru in a pullout near the first bridge on Libby Creek Road, we stretched our legs and breathed in the pine-scented air. The forest around us towered in thick, impenetrable walls of green, creating an enclosed world that felt both beautiful and somehow claustrophobic. The creek itself was crystal clear, trickling gently between gravel bars shaded by dense stands of towering evergreens. Their branches interlocked overhead like skeletal fingers, filtering the evening sunlight into scattered patches of gold and shadow. The silence was profound. Not the comfortable quiet of civilization, but the deep, watchful silence of wilderness. Every small sound seemed amplified. The snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of a bird that sounded almost human in its distress. We hadn't been there 5 minutes before we met another vehicle pulling in. A weathered but well-kept pickup truck. The driver was a friendly-looking man in his early 40s who stepped out with easy confidence, accompanied by his son, who couldn't have been older than 11. The boy's eyes were bright with excitement, darting between us and the creek with obvious enthusiasm. They introduced themselves as Jason and his son Timothy, and Jason seemed genuinely excited to find newcomers interested in gold panning. After chatting briefly about our plans, Jason offered to show us a better spot downstream. His voice carried the authority of someone who'd spent countless hours in these mountains. "I have a small claim down this way," he explained, nodding toward a narrow dirt path that followed the creek's meandering course. "The gravel there hasn't been picked over as much. You'll have better luck." His son bounced on his toes, clearly eager to share their secret spot. Ryan and I gladly accepted the offer, grabbing our basic gear and following the father and son down the shaded trail. The walk wasn't far, just 10 minutes through dense forest that seemed to close in around us with each step. Towering pines and firs created a natural cathedral, their branches so thick overhead that the dying light barely penetrated to the forest floor. Our footsteps crunched softly on a carpet of pine needles and fallen branches, and I noticed how the temperature dropped noticeably in the shadows. The air felt heavier here, charged with the earthy scent of decomposing vegetation, and something else I couldn't quite identify, something metallic and stale. Soon enough, we emerged onto a secluded gravel bar where the creek made a gentle bend. The water moved more slowly here, creating perfect conditions for gold to settle in the sediment. Jason immediately went to work, demonstrating the proper technique with practiced ease. His weathered hands moved with precision as he filled his pan with gravel and water, swirling it in a hypnotic rhythm that his son matched perfectly. "See how the black sand settles at the bottom?" Jason explained, his voice low and focused. "That's where you'll find the gold if there is any." Timothy held up his own pan proudly, revealing several tiny flecks that glinted in the fading light. "Found these just yesterday," he said with obvious pride. The boy's enthusiasm was infectious, and soon Ryan and I were kneeling by the water's edge, trying to master the technique ourselves. The next 2 hours passed peacefully as we worked side by side. The gentle sound of moving water was soothing, and Jason proved to be an excellent teacher, patient, and encouraging. He told stories of the area's mining history, speaking of prospectors who'd worked these creeks for over a century. But as the shadows lengthened and the air grew cooler, I noticed subtle changes in our surroundings. The bird calls had stopped entirely. The forest felt like it was holding its breath, waiting. The comfortable atmosphere began to shift as darkness crept closer. What had felt like peaceful solitude now seemed more like isolation. I found myself glancing frequently over my shoulder, scanning the tree line for movement that never came. The weight of the surrounding wilderness pressed in on us, and I became acutely aware of how alone we were, how far from help, how easy it would be for someone to approach unseen through the dense forest. It was sometime after 8 when I asked, half jokingly, trying to lighten the mood that had settled over me like a damp blanket, "Do you guys ever find anything weird out here besides gold?" The words left my mouth before I could reconsider them, and immediately I wished I could take them back. Jason's friendly smile faded slightly, replaced by something more serious, more cautious. He exchanged a quick, meaningful look with his son before answering, and in that brief moment of silent communication, I saw something that made my stomach tighten. "Actually, yes," Jason said slowly, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. He glanced around nervously, as if the forest itself might be listening. "Last fall, just down the creek from here, we stumbled on something pretty unsettling." Timothy's eyes grew wide and serious, the boyish enthusiasm draining from his face. "Yeah," he jumped in, his voice small but clear. "It was a human arm." I waited for them to laugh, to break the tension with a joke or explanation, but they didn't. The silence stretched uncomfortably as both father and son stared at the water, lost in the memory. Ryan's smile vanished completely, and I felt my heart rate increase as the implications sank in. The forest around us suddenly felt different. Not peaceful, but menacing. Every shadow seemed deeper, every sound more sinister. Jason continued cautiously, his voice measured and deliberate, as if he'd told this story before but never got used to it. "We reported it to the authorities, of course, but nothing ever came of it. The investigation just stopped. Folks go missing out here pretty often, more than you'd think. Sometimes they wander off trail, sometimes they get lost in a storm. But, honestly..." He paused, scanning the darkening tree line. "A lot of them just vanish without a trace." "There are people living in these mountains," he continued, his voice growing more urgent. "After those wildfires a few years back, the government estimated there might be more than 10,000 folks living completely off-grid in these forests. No identification, no addresses, no way to track them. Some are just trying to live free, but others..." He trailed off, shaking his head. "Others are hiding from something, or hiding because they've done something. You've got to be careful out here, especially after dark." I glanced over at Ryan, silently communicating my growing discomfort, but neither of us said anything. Jason wasn't trying to scare us. I could see that he was genuinely concerned for our safety. But the warm evening had taken on a distinctly cold edge, and every rustle in the underbrush now seemed potentially threatening. The forest that had seemed so beautiful an hour earlier now loomed over us like a living thing, full of hidden dangers and unseen watchers. Around 8:30 I stood up and stretched, my muscles stiff from crouching by the creek. The temperature had dropped significantly as the sun disappeared behind the mountains, and I could feel goosebumps rising on my arms. "I'm going to grab my sweatshirt from the car before it gets any darker," I announced, trying to keep my voice light despite the uneasiness that had settled in my chest like a cold stone. The walk back up the trail alone was an entirely different experience from the journey down. Every step seemed to echo more loudly in the oppressive silence, and I found myself moving faster than necessary, driven by an inexplicable urge to get back to the relative safety of our car. The forest pressed in on both sides of the narrow path, and I became hyper-aware of every sound: the creak of branches overhead, the skitter of small animals in the underbrush, the distant hoot of an owl that sounded almost mournful. As I reached our Subaru, movement caught my eye on the main road. A dark gray pickup truck was passing slowly, much slower than seemed normal for this stretch of road. Dogs were barking frantically from inside the cab, their sounds sharp and aggressive in the still air. I couldn't see the driver clearly through the tinted windows, just a vague silhouette hunched over the steering wheel. Something about the scene felt wrong, though I couldn't put my finger on exactly what it was. The truck's lack of urgency bothered me most. Vehicles were allowed on this road, certainly, but most drivers would pass through at normal speed, maybe offering a friendly wave to fellow outdoor enthusiasts. This driver seemed to be studying the area, taking inventory of who was here and what they were doing. The dog's frantic barking suggested they were agitated, possibly even trained for something specific. Hunting dogs, maybe, or worse. I grabbed my sweatshirt from the car, locked the doors carefully, and hurried back down the trail, my heart beating faster with each step. The darkness seemed to deepen around me as I walked, and I found myself looking over my shoulder repeatedly, half expecting to see someone following me through the trees. The sensation of being watched was so strong it made my skin crawl, and I nearly ran the last 100 yards back to where the others waited by the creek. By the time I returned to our gold panning spot, Jason and Timothy were already packing up their gear, their movements quick and efficient. The easy camaraderie of the earlier evening had evaporated, replaced by something tenser, more alert. Jason's eyes kept scanning the forest around us, and I noticed he positioned himself between his son and the tree line, a protective instinct that hadn't been there before. "Getting late," Jason said by way of explanation, though his voice carried undertones of something more urgent. "These mountains change after dark. Different kind of people come out, different kind of activities." He shouldered his pack and helped Timothy organize his equipment. "You folks be real careful out here tonight. Maybe consider heading back to town, getting a hotel room. The Libby Inn isn't fancy, but it's safe." Timothy looked up at his father with eyes that seemed older than his 11 years. "Tell them about the sounds," he whispered, tugging on Jason's sleeve. Jason's jaw tightened, and he glanced around nervously before kneeling down to his son's level. "What sounds, buddy?" But Timothy just shook his head, suddenly reluctant to speak, his gaze fixed on the darkening forest. "They wished us well," Jason pressing a business card into Ryan's hand. "Call me if anything happens," he said seriously. "Anything at all. I'm only 20 minutes away." The weight of his concern was unmistakable, and as they disappeared up the trail toward their own vehicle, I felt increasingly exposed on the isolated gravel bar. Ryan and I lingered a few more minutes, trying to recapture the peaceful mood of earlier. But the magic was gone. Every sound seemed amplified and threatening. The hoot of an owl, the splash of a fish jumping, the rustle of something large moving through the underbrush upstream. The creek that had seemed so welcoming now felt like a barrier, cutting us off from civilization and help. "We should head back," I said finally, though I tried to keep my voice casual. Ryan nodded, gathering our equipment with unusual haste. As we started up the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being observed, that unfriendly eyes were tracking our every movement through the darkness. The sensation was so strong it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up, and I found myself walking closer to Ryan, taking comfort in his solid presence beside me. We reached our car just as true darkness settled over the forest, and I immediately felt safer inside the Subaru's locked interior. Ryan paused at the bridge, curious about another area he'd noticed earlier across from our pullout. The beam of his flashlight revealed what looked like another access point to the creek, possibly offering different gold panning opportunities. "I'll just take a quick look," he said casually, already moving toward the narrow trail. "You can wait here if you want." Despite everything in me screaming not to split up, I nodded and climbed into the passenger seat, locking the door immediately behind me. The interior of the car felt like a fortress compared to the exposed vulnerability of the creek bank. But even here, I couldn't escape the feeling of being hunted. The darkness outside was complete now, broken only by scattered stars and the dim glow of our car's interior lights. Every shadow seemed to move. Every sound seemed magnified. I found myself checking the mirrors compulsively, scanning for any sign of movement or threat. The memory of that slow-moving gray truck with its barking dogs replayed in my mind, and I wondered if the driver was still in the area, still watching. Minutes passed like hours as I waited for Ryan to return. My hands were sweating despite the cool evening air, and my heart rate remained elevated. When I finally saw his flashlight beam bobbing back toward the car, relief flooded through me, until I saw his posture. He was moving quickly, almost jogging, his body language screaming urgency and fear. Ryan reached the car and immediately yanked open the driver's door, practically throwing himself inside. His face was pale in the dashboard light, and there was something wild in his eyes that I'd never seen before. "Something's wrong," he said without preamble. his voice tight with controlled panic. I had this overwhelming feeling like someone was watching me down there. Not just watching, studying, like I was being evaluated by a predator. Before I could respond, we both saw it at the same time. Headlights approaching slowly from the direction we'd come. The familiar dark gray pickup truck rolled to a stop halfway across the bridge, directly blocking our only exit route. The engine continued to idle, a low rumbling that seemed to vibrate through the car's frame and into my bones. Those same dogs were barking again, their voices sharp and insistent in the night air. My stomach twisted into knots as we watched the truck's driver door open with deliberate slowness. The man who stepped out was thin and wiry, probably in his mid-50s, wearing faded jeans and a plaid shirt that had seen better days. A baseball cap was pulled low over his eyes, casting his face in shadow, but I could feel the intensity of his gaze as he approached our car with measured steps. There was something predatory in the way he moved, not rushed, but purposeful, like someone who had all the time in the world and complete confidence in his ability to control the situation. His hands hung loosely at his sides, but I noticed how they remained positioned for quick movement, how his body stayed balanced and ready. This wasn't a casual encounter with a curious local. This was something much more dangerous. Ryan cracked his window just enough to hear, but not enough for the man to reach through. "Evening?" he called out, his voice carefully controlled despite the fear I could hear underneath. "Are you the landowner here?" The question was strategic, I realized. An attempt to establish some legitimate reason for this confrontation, some innocent explanation for why we were being blocked in. The man paused just outside comfortable conversational distance, close enough to intimidate but far enough to maintain an escape route if needed. When he spoke, his voice was quiet and calm, but there was something underneath it that made my skin crawl. "No," he answered slowly, drawing out the word. "Just curious what you folks are doing out here so late at night." The way he said curious suggested something far more sinister than casual interest. His eyes, what I could see of them under the cap's brim, seemed to catalog every detail of our car, our faces, our body language. He was gathering information, filing away details for some unknown purpose. The dogs in his truck had quieted but remained visible as dark shapes moving restlessly behind the windows. "We were gold panning," Ryan replied, his voice steady despite the tension I could see in his white knuckles gripping the steering wheel. "Just finishing up, actually. We're heading out now." But even as he spoke, I could see this wasn't going to be that simple. The man's slight smile suggested he had no intention of letting us leave easily. The stranger tilted his head slightly, considering Ryan's response with the patience of someone who held all the cards in a game we didn't even know we were playing. "Gold panning, huh?" he echoed, his voice carrying a note of amusement that chilled me to the bone. He stepped closer to our car, close enough that I could smell something unpleasant. Stale cigarettes, unwashed clothing, and something else that made my stomach turn. "Just the two of you?" The question was asked with false casualness, but the underlying threat was unmistakable. His gaze lingered on me specifically, and I shrank deeper into my seat, trying to make myself invisible. There was something in his eyes that spoke of violence, of terrible experiences and worse intentions. This wasn't a random encounter. He had been watching us, waiting for the right moment. "Yeah, just us," Ryan answered coolly, nodding toward the road behind the man's truck. "Mind if we squeeze past?" But instead of moving aside, the man stepped back slowly, returning to his vehicle with that same deliberate, predatory movement. He climbed behind the wheel, and for a moment, I thought we were free. Then his reverse lights flashed, and the truck backed up suddenly, positioning itself to block us even more completely. The horn blast that followed made me jump so violently I hit my head on the car's roof. It was sharp, aggressive, deliberate, a sound designed to intimidate and disorient. When the man emerged from his truck again, his demeanor had changed subtly. The false friendliness was gone, replaced by something more honest, and infinitely more terrifying. "Are you folks looking for something specific out here?" he asked, his voice tighter now, more direct. When Ryan repeated that we were just leaving, the man ignored him completely. "You know, there's a real nice private campground about a mile up the road. Real peaceful. Quiet. Hardly anyone ever goes there." The way he emphasized private and quiet made it clear this wasn't a helpful suggestion. It was a threat disguised as an invitation. "Might be perfect for a young couple like yourselves," he continued, his eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "Real private. No one to bother you, no one to hear you if you need help." The pause before help was deliberate, loaded with implications that made my blood freeze. After what felt like an eternity of psychological torture, he finally moved his truck forward, clearing our exit. "Go," I whispered urgently, gripping Ryan's arm hard enough to leave marks. As we passed the gray truck, I couldn't help but glance toward the driver's window. The man sat motionless, both hands gripping the wheel, his face expressionless, but his eyes, God, his eyes were like a shark's, cold and empty, and completely without human warmth. "That was way too weird," Ryan muttered as we accelerated toward the main road. "Who stops random people at night without any legitimate reason? And those dogs? Did you hear how agitated they were?" But before I could even formulate a response, something caught my eye in our headlights ahead. There, standing at the edge of the forest where the trail met the road, was a figure. Motionless, watching, waiting in the darkness as if he had known exactly where we would emerge and exactly when. The figure stepped back into the shadows as our headlights swept past, but not before I caught a glimpse of the same plaid shirt, the same baseball cap. Somehow, impossibly, he had gotten ahead of us. Somehow he was still hunting. The morning air was crisp against my skin as I loaded the last of my gear into the truck. October in the Pacific Northwest always brought that perfect combination of cool temperatures and stunning autumn colors that made every photographer's heart race. I had been planning this solo expedition for months, carefully selecting the most remote section of the Cascade Range where civilization felt like a distant memory. My camera bag held my most prized possessions: a professional DSLR, 3 different lenses, extra memory cards, and enough batteries to last 2 weeks. The camping gear filled the rest of the space: a 4-season tent, sleeping bag rated for freezing temperatures, portable stove, water filtration system, and enough dehydrated meals to sustain me for 10 days. I had done this routine dozens of times before, but something felt different about this particular trip. There was an urgency, almost a compulsion, that had driven me to choose this specific location. The drive took 3 hours on increasingly narrow roads until I reached the trailhead. The parking area was empty, which wasn't surprising given how remote this location was. Most hikers preferred the more accessible trails closer to the main highways. I preferred the solitude, the complete disconnection from the modern world that only true wilderness could provide. As I shouldered my 60-pound pack, the familiar weight settled into the grooves my shoulders had worn over years of backcountry travel. The trail began as a well-marked path through second-growth forest, but I knew that within a few miles it would fade into little more than game trails and compass bearings. The forest closed around me like a living cathedral. Ancient Douglas firs stretched toward the sky, their trunks so massive that 3 people holding hands couldn't encircle them. Moss draped everything in shades of emerald and jade, creating a softness that muffled every sound. The air smelled of decay and growth, the eternal cycle of the forest floor where fallen giants fed the next generation of trees. I walked for hours, stopping occasionally to photograph particularly striking compositions. A fallen log covered in tiny mushrooms, the way afternoon light filtered through the canopy, creating columns of gold in the green darkness. My camera clicked steadily, capturing images that would never quite convey the true majesty of this place. By late afternoon, I had traveled nearly 8 miles from the trailhead. The official trail had disappeared hours ago, leaving me to navigate by topographical map and compass. I found myself in a small clearing beside a creek, the water running clear and cold over polished stones. The sound of moving water would provide a soothing soundtrack for the evening, and the open space would give me room to set up camp without having to clear undergrowth. Setting up camp was a practiced ritual. I cleared the ground of rocks and sticks, pitched my tent on a slight rise to avoid any potential flooding, and established a fire ring with stones from the creek bed. The portable stove would handle my cooking needs, but there was something deeply satisfying about having a real fire, especially as the days grew shorter and the nights longer. As the sun began its descent behind the western peaks, I prepared a simple meal of pasta and dried vegetables. The silence of the forest was profound, broken only by the gentle murmur of the creek and the occasional call of a bird settling in for the night. This was what I had come for: complete solitude, total peace. The chance to disconnect from the chaos of modern life and reconnect with something more primal and true. But as darkness began to creep through the trees, something changed. The bird calls stopped. The small rustlings and movements that typically characterized a healthy forest ecosystem simply ceased. The silence that remained wasn't the peaceful quiet I had been enjoying. It was something else entirely. Something that made my skin crawl and my heart rate quicken. I told myself it was normal. Wildlife patterns could be unpredictable. Weather changes, the presence of predators, even the phase of the moon could affect animal behavior. But as I sat by my small campfire, the flames casting dancing shadows on the surrounding trees, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong with this place. I woke before dawn to the sound of absolute silence. Not the peaceful quiet of wilderness morning, but a vacuum of sound that felt unnatural and deeply disturbing. Even the creek seemed muted, its gentle babbling reduced to barely audible whispers. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring up at the tent ceiling, trying to identify what was bothering me so intensely. The air inside the tent felt thick and oppressive, despite the ventilation flaps being open. I could smell something underneath the usual forest scents of moss and decomposing leaves, something musky and wild like wet fur and something else I couldn't identify. The odor was faint but persistent, and it seemed to be getting stronger. I unzipped the tent flap and stepped outside into the gray pre-dawn light. The fire had died to cold ashes sometime during the night, though I was certain I had banked it properly before going to sleep. The clearing looked different somehow, though I couldn't immediately identify what had changed. The trees seemed to press closer, their shadows deeper and more menacing than they had appeared the evening before. As I walked to the creek to fill my water bottles, I noticed the first concrete sign that something was amiss. In the soft mud beside the water, clear as day, was a footprint unlike anything I had ever seen. It was enormous, easily 18 inches long and nearly half as wide. The impression showed 5 distinct toes, each ending in what appeared to be a claw mark. But the overall shape was disturbingly human-like, as if someone had taken a human foot and scaled it up to impossible proportions. My hands trembled as I knelt beside the print, pulling out my camera to document what I was seeing. The depth of the impression suggested whatever had made it weighed considerably more than any known animal in this region. The edges were crisp and clean, indicating it had been made recently, probably during the night while I slept just 50 yards away. I spent the next hour searching the immediate area and found 3 more prints, forming a rough circle around my campsite. The stride length between prints was enormous, suggesting a creature that stood well over 7 feet tall. Claw marks scored several nearby trees at a height that made my stomach clench with fear. The gouges were 8 feet off the ground, far too high for any bear or other known predator. The rational part of my mind tried to find explanations. Perhaps it was an elaborate hoax, though the remoteness of the location made that unlikely. Maybe the prints belonged to a bear with an unusual gait, though no bear I knew of could leave marks that distinct or that high off the ground. But as I examined each piece of evidence, the explanations became increasingly far-fetched. I spent the day hiking through the surrounding forest, ostensibly looking for photographic opportunities, but really trying to find some logical explanation for what I had discovered. The forest felt different during daylight hours, still unnaturally quiet, but less immediately threatening. I managed to capture some decent images of fungi and moss formations, but my heart wasn't really in it. Throughout the day, I had the persistent feeling of being watched. Several times I spun around, certain I had glimpsed movement in my peripheral vision, only to find empty forest behind me. Twice I heard what sounded like branches breaking under considerable weight, but when I investigated, I found nothing that could explain the sounds. The most disturbing incident occurred around midday when I was photographing a particularly striking old-growth cedar. I was adjusting my camera settings when I heard what could only be described as breathing, deep, rhythmic inhalations and exhalations that seemed to come from directly behind me. I froze, my finger on the camera's shutter release, afraid to turn around. The breathing continued for perhaps 30 seconds before gradually fading away. When I finally worked up the courage to look behind me, I found another footprint in a patch of soft earth. This one even clearer than the ones I had discovered that morning. The toes were spread wide, as if whatever had made it had been moving carefully, trying to remain silent. The implications sent ice through my veins. As evening approached and I made my way back to camp, I found myself walking faster and faster, eventually breaking into a nervous trot. The shadows seemed to move independently of the wind, and every sound made me jump. By the time I reached my clearing, my heart was pounding and sweat was running down my back despite the cool temperature. I built my fire larger than necessary, creating a circle of light that pushed back the encroaching darkness. But as I sat beside the flames, eating a tasteless meal of dried rice and vegetables, I realized that all the light in the world wouldn't protect me from whatever was out there in the darkness, watching and waiting. The second night was when everything changed. I had reinforced my campsite as best I could, hanging my food from a high branch and clearing away any brush that might provide concealment for whatever was stalking me. I kept the fire burning bright and stayed awake as long as possible, but eventually exhaustion overcame fear and I dozed fitfully in my tent. I jerked awake to the sound of footsteps circling my camp. Not the careful, stealthy movements I might have expected from a wild animal, but deliberate, measured steps that spoke of intelligence and intent. The footsteps moved in a slow circle around my tent, each step heavy enough to vibrate through the ground and up into my sleeping bag. My mouth went dry and my heart hammered against my ribs as I listened to the methodical patrol. Whatever was out there wasn't just passing through. It was studying me, learning my habits, perhaps deciding what to do with me. The footsteps would pause occasionally, and during those terrifying silences, I could hear deep, rumbling breathing that sounded disturbingly like a cross between human and animal. I fumbled for my flashlight with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The beam cut through the tent fabric and illuminated the surrounding forest, but the footsteps had stopped the moment I turned it on. The silence that followed was somehow more terrifying than the sounds had been. I knew it was still out there, just beyond the reach of my light, watching and waiting. For what felt like hours, I lay frozen in my sleeping bag, the flashlight clutched in my sweaty hands, straining to hear any sound that might tell me what was happening outside my thin nylon shelter. The fire had died down to glowing embers, casting weak, flickering shadows that danced across the tent walls like grasping fingers. Then I heard it. A sound that will haunt me for the rest of my life. It started as a low rumble, like distant thunder, but gradually rose in pitch until it became a howl that seemed to come from the depths of hell itself. The sound was impossibly deep and loud, reverberating through the forest and seeming to shake the very ground beneath me. But what made it truly terrifying was the intelligence behind it. This wasn't the random vocalization of a wild animal, but a deliberate communication. A message meant specifically for me. The howl went on for nearly 30 seconds before trailing off into a series of guttural growls and clicking sounds that reminded me sickeningly of language. Whatever was out there was trying to communicate, and the message was crystal clear. I was not welcome here. When morning finally came, I emerged from my tent to find evidence that my night visitor had been even closer than I had imagined. The embers of my fire had been scattered, still warm coals spread across the clearing in a pattern that looked almost like symbols. My camp stove had been moved from where I had left it, relocated to the exact center of the clearing, and surrounded by a circle of perfectly arranged pine cones. But the most disturbing discovery was the message left on my tent. Scratched into the nylon fabric were 4 parallel lines, each about 8 inches long and clearly made by claws. The cuts hadn't gone all the way through the material, but they had removed the waterproof coating, leaving bright yellow streaks against the green fabric. The scratches were positioned at exactly the height where my head had been while I lay inside. I spent the morning documenting everything with my camera, though I knew the photographs would never convey the sheer terror of the experience. The footprints were everywhere now, no longer confined to the creek bed but crisscrossing the entire clearing in complex patterns that suggested hours of activity. Some of the prints were so clear I could make out individual toe pad impressions and the texture of what appeared to be coarse hair on the sides of the feet. The tree markings had multiplied as well. What had been isolated claw marks the day before were now elaborate scorings that covered dozens of trees around my camp. Some of the marks were fresh, the white wood still weeping sap, while others appeared older, as if whatever was doing this had been using this area for a long time. As I examined the evidence, a horrible realization began to dawn on me. This wasn't random behavior. It was territorial marking. Whatever was out there had claimed this area as its own, and I was being warned to leave. But there was something else in the markings, something that suggested a level of intelligence and planning that no known animal possessed. The scratches on the trees weren't random gouges but seemed to follow patterns, almost like a primitive form of writing. Some of the markings were arranged in groups of 3 or 4, while others formed intricate spirals and intersecting lines. It was as if I had stumbled into the territory of something that existed at the boundary between animal and something far more disturbing. I made the decision to leave immediately. Whatever was out there had shown remarkable restraint so far, but I sensed that restraint was wearing thin. The messages were becoming more aggressive, more direct, and I had no desire to find out what the next escalation might involve. But as I began to pack my gear, I realized I was no longer alone in the daylight hours. Movement in the trees around the clearing caught my eye. Not the random motion of wind-blown branches, but purposeful movement that stayed always at the edge of visibility. Whatever was stalking me had decided stealth was no longer necessary. Packing my gear became an exercise in controlled terror. Every few seconds, I would catch glimpses of something moving through the trees, a flash of dark fur, the gleam of eyes, a massive shape shifting between the massive trunks of the old-growth forest. Whatever was out there had abandoned all pretense of hiding and was now openly stalking me as I prepared to leave its territory. My hands shook so badly I could barely zip my pack closed. Items I had packed and repacked hundreds of times suddenly seemed impossible to organize. I kept dropping things, my fingers refusing to work properly as adrenaline flooded my system. The familiar routines that usually brought me comfort now felt like obstacles keeping me trapped in this nightmare. The sounds were getting closer. I could hear branches snapping under considerable weight. The distinctive sound of something large pushing through the underbrush without concern for stealth. Occasionally, there would be a low rumbling growl that seemed to come from multiple directions at once, as if the forest itself had developed a voice and was expressing its displeasure with my presence. I shouldered my pack, the weight that had felt manageable yesterday now seeming impossibly heavy. My legs felt weak and unsteady, but I forced myself to start moving toward what I hoped was the direction of the trail. The forest that had seemed beautiful and welcoming just 2 days ago now felt like a maze designed to trap me, every tree looking identical, every shadow potentially concealing a threat. The harassment began almost immediately. Rocks would come sailing out of the forest to crash into trees just feet away from me. They weren't thrown with enough force to cause serious harm, but the message was clear. Whatever was out there could hit me anytime it wanted. The psychological effect was devastating, turning every step into an act of courage. Branches would suddenly snap and fall across my path, forcing me to detour around them and further confusing my sense of direction. Twice, I came across trees that had been freshly uprooted and deliberately placed to block my route. Each obstacle required precious time and energy to navigate around, and I could sense my stalker's satisfaction with each delay. The worst part was the sounds that followed me. Heavy footsteps that stayed always just behind the limit of visibility, moving with a gait that was disturbingly similar to a human walk, but with a stride length that spoke of something much larger. The breathing was constant now, deep and rhythmic, like a steam engine building pressure. About an hour into my escape attempt, I made a critical error. In my panic to keep moving, I had been following what appeared to be an animal trail without paying proper attention to my compass bearing. When I finally stopped to check my position, I realized I had been walking in a wide circle and was actually farther from the main trail than when I had started. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I was lost in territory controlled by something that wanted me gone, something that seemed to be herding me deeper into the wilderness rather than allowing me to escape. The rational part of my mind tried to maintain that I was dealing with an animal, perhaps a bear with unusual behavior, but the evidence of intelligence and planning was becoming impossible to ignore. I pulled out my topographical map and compass, trying to ignore the sounds of movement in the forest around me while I plotted a new course. The terrain was steep and broken, cut by ravines and blocked by areas of fallen timber that would be nearly impossible to navigate with a full pack. But I had to try. Staying in one place was no longer an option. As I studied the map, a shadow fell across the paper. I looked up to see a massive shape standing perhaps 50 yards away, partially concealed behind a cluster of cedar trees. For the first time, I got a clear look at what had been stalking me, and the sight nearly stopped my heart. It stood at least 9 feet tall on 2 legs, covered in dark brown fur that looked coarse and matted. The head was enormous, somewhere between human and ape, with intelligent eyes that reflected the filtered sunlight like mirrors. Its shoulders were impossibly broad, and arms that hung nearly to its knees ended in hands that were clearly capable of the destruction I had witnessed at my campsite. We stared at each other for perhaps 10 seconds, predator and prey locked in a moment of mutual assessment. Then it tilted its head back and released another of those bone-chilling howls, the sound echoing through the forest like a declaration of ownership. The message was unmistakable. This was its domain, and I was an unwelcome intruder who had already stayed far too long. When the howl ended, the creature took a deliberate step forward, then another. It wasn't charging or showing aggression in the traditional sense, but it was making its intentions clear. The time for warnings had passed. Now it was simply going to remove me from its territory, and I suspected its methods would be far from gentle. I ran. Running through old-growth forest with a 60-pound pack is a special kind of hell. Every step was a calculated risk, every obstacle a potential trap. Fallen logs became hurdles that had to be vaulted or climbed over, consuming precious energy and time. Root systems created ankle-breaking hazards hidden under carpets of fallen leaves. Low branches grabbed at my pack and clothes, trying to slow me down and keep me within reach of the nightmare that pursued me. Behind me, the sounds of pursuit were terrifying in their consistency. Unlike a typical predator that might make a quick rush and then give up, this thing was maintaining a steady pace that suggested it could keep this up for hours. The footsteps were heavy and regular, accompanied by the sound of vegetation being crushed and trees being pushed aside with casual strength. I could hear its breathing, deep and rhythmic like a bellows, but without any sign of exertion. Whatever this creature was, it was built for endurance, designed to chase down prey over long distances. The realization that I was engaged in a pursuit I could not possibly win sent fresh waves of panic through my system. My pack, which had been a carefully balanced load that morning, now felt like it was full of concrete blocks. The camera equipment that represented months of savings bounced against my back with every step, the metal corners digging into my spine. My sleeping bag, lashed to the bottom of the pack, kept catching on branches and nearly yanking me off my feet. I tried to remember my emergency training, the wilderness survival courses I had taken years ago that emphasized staying calm and thinking clearly in crisis situations. But all of that rational thought was overwhelmed by the primitive terror of being hunted by something that should not exist, something that challenged every assumption I had about the natural world. The creature behind me began to vocalize as it ran, releasing a series of grunts and barks that sounded disturbingly like laughter. It was enjoying this, treating my desperate flight as some form of entertainment. The psychological impact was devastating. Being hunted was bad enough, but being hunted by something that found my terror amusing was beyond my ability to process. A creek appeared ahead, cutting across my path in a steep-sided ravine about 20 feet wide. Under normal circumstances, I would have looked for a safer crossing point, but normal circumstances no longer applied. I didn't slow down, launching myself across the gap with desperation-fueled strength. I almost made it. My feet hit the far bank, but the soft earth crumbled under my weight and I slid backward into the icy water. The creek was only about 3 feet deep, but the shock of the cold water and the weight of my pack drove me to my knees. I struggled to maintain my footing on the slippery rocks, aware that this delay might have given my pursuer the opportunity it needed to close the distance. I scrambled up the far bank, my clothes soaked and my body temperature dropping rapidly. Behind me, I heard a sound that made my blood freeze. The creature had stopped at the edge of the ravine and was making what could only be described as laughing sounds. Deep, rumbling chuckles that spoke of intelligence and amusement at my predicament. Looking back over my shoulder as I continued to run, I saw it standing at the edge of the ravine, making no attempt to cross. Instead, it raised one massive arm and pointed in the direction I was heading, then began moving parallel to the creek, staying on its side of the water while I stumbled through the forest on mine. The horrible realization dawned on me that it wasn't just chasing me, it was herding me, driving me in a specific direction for reasons I couldn't begin to understand. This wasn't the random pursuit of a wild animal protecting its territory, but a calculated hunt with an objective I couldn't comprehend. The terrain ahead was getting steeper and more difficult, cut by more ravines and blocked by areas where fallen trees had created nearly impenetrable tangles. I was being driven into increasingly difficult terrain, away from any possible help, and deeper into wilderness that might not see another human being for years. My strength was failing rapidly. The combination of fear, cold, and physical exertion was taking its toll, and I could feel my coordination beginning to break down. I stumbled more frequently, caught my feet on roots and rocks, and had to rest more often despite the presence of the creature that continued to parallel my course. During one of these brief rests, gasping for breath behind a massive Douglas fir, I heard something that chilled me more than anything that had come before. The creature had begun to call, releasing a series of howls and barks that echoed through the forest. After a few moments, those calls were answered by similar vocalizations from at least 2 different directions. It wasn't alone. There were others, and they were coordinating their efforts to trap me in these trackless woods. I was no longer being chased by a single creature protecting its territory. I was being hunted by a pack of intelligent predators who had turned my escape into some kind of organized operation. The sounds of pursuit had multiplied, coming from multiple directions now as the creatures worked together to drive me towards some predetermined destination. Whatever that destination was, I had no desire to discover what waited for me there. The forest around me had become a nightmare maze of sound and movement. No matter which direction I tried to turn, there were signs of the creatures moving to cut off my escape routes. They communicated with each other through a series of barks, howls, and clicking sounds that demonstrated a level of coordination that no known animal species possessed. I was being driven uphill now, toward what my topographical map showed as a series of cliffs and dead-end canyons. The terrain was becoming increasingly treacherous, with loose rock and steep grades that made every step dangerous. My pursuers seemed to know exactly where they were hurting me, and the destination was clearly not going to be pleasant. My pack had become an unbearable burden, but I was afraid to abandon it because it contained my only emergency supplies. The camera equipment that had been so important to me just days ago now seemed like meaningless weight that was hastening my death. But the sleeping bag and emergency food might be the difference between surviving a night in the wilderness and becoming a statistic. The sounds of the hunt had become a constant background noise, heavy footsteps moving through the underbrush, branches breaking under considerable weight, and those disturbing vocalizations that continued to coordinate the creature's movements. Occasionally, I would catch glimpses of dark shapes moving between the trees, always staying just at the edge of clear visibility, but making their presence unmistakably known. I stumbled into a small clearing and realized I had made a critical error. The open space was surrounded on 3 sides by steep rock walls that rose at least 50 feet into the canopy. The only exit was the way I had come in, and that route was now blocked by the sounds of approaching footsteps from multiple directions. This was what they had been driving me toward. A natural trap where my mobility would be completely eliminated, and escape would be impossible. I turned in a slow circle, looking up at the cliff walls and realizing that climbing them with my pack would be impossible. And climbing them without my survival gear would leave me exposed and defenseless, even if I managed to reach the top. The footsteps were getting closer, coming from the mouth of the canyon behind me. I could hear at least 3 distinct sets of footfalls, moving with the confidence of predators who knew their prey was cornered. The vocalizations had stopped, replaced by a silence that was somehow more terrifying than all the noise had been. I pressed my back against the far wall of the canyon, feeling the cold stone through my wet clothes. My heart was beating so hard I thought it might explode, and my breathing was coming in ragged gasps that echoed off the rock walls around me. Every shadow seemed to be moving, every sound magnified by the acoustic properties of the enclosed space. The first creature appeared at the mouth of the canyon, and seeing it in full daylight was more terrifying than any of my previous glimpses had been. It was massive, easily 9 feet tall and built like a linebacker, but with proportions that were disturbingly wrong. The arms were too long, the shoulders too broad, the head too large for anything that should exist in the natural world. Its fur was dark brown and matted, hanging in clumps that suggested a life spent in the deep forest far from any human contact. But it was the eyes that were most disturbing, intelligent, calculating, and filled with something that might have been curiosity about what it had cornered in this stone trap. A second creature appeared beside the first, then a third. They moved with a coordination that spoke of intelligence and planning, spreading out across the mouth of the canyon to eliminate any possibility of escape. Each was slightly different from the others, variations in size and coloring that suggested they were individuals rather than some uniform species. They stood there for what felt like an eternity, studying me with those unsettling, intelligent eyes. I had expected them to charge, to finish whatever game they had been playing with me during the chase through the forest. Instead, they seemed to be evaluating me, perhaps deciding what to do with their captured prey. The largest of the 3, the one that had first revealed itself to me back at my camp, took a step forward. Then another. Its movements were deliberate and controlled, showing no sign of aggression but making it clear that it was in complete control of the situation. When it was about 10 feet away from me, it stopped and tilted its massive head to one side, studying me like a curious child examining an interesting insect. Then it did something that nearly stopped my heart. It spoke. Not in English, not in any human language, but in a series of complex vocalizations that were clearly communicative. The sounds were directed at its companions, but the creature never took its eyes off me while it spoke. The other 2 responded with their own vocalizations, and I realized I was listening to a conversation about my fate conducted by beings that should not exist. The discussion went on for several minutes, with different creatures contributing what sounded like opinions or suggestions. The tones varied from what might have been curiosity to what sounded disturbingly like hunger. I stood frozen against the rock wall, unable to move or think clearly, while my captors decided what to do with me. Finally, the conversation ended. The largest creature took another step forward, so close now that I could smell its musky odor and see the intelligence burning in its eyes. It reached out with one massive hand, extending a finger that ended in a claw easily 3 inches long. I closed my eyes, certain that this was the end, that whatever these creatures were, they had decided I represented a threat that needed to be eliminated. The claw touched my forehead, surprisingly gently, and stayed there for perhaps 5 seconds. Then the creature stepped back and released another of those earth-shaking howls that had terrorized me throughout this ordeal. When I opened my eyes, all 3 creatures had turned away and were walking back toward the mouth of the canyon. The largest one looked back at me once, its expression unreadable, before disappearing into the forest with its companions. I remained pressed against the rock wall for at least another hour, unable to believe that they had simply left me alive. The silence of the forest gradually returned to normal. Bird calls resumed, small animals began moving through the underbrush, and the oppressive sense of being watched slowly faded away. When I finally worked up the courage to move away from the rock wall, my legs nearly gave out from the combination of exhaustion and shock. The creatures had vanished as completely as if they had never existed, leaving me alone in the canyon with nothing but my own traumatic memories as proof of what had happened. I checked my camera, hoping I had managed to capture some evidence during my ordeal, but found that in my panic, I had failed to take a single photograph of the creatures themselves. The images on my memory card showed only forest scenery from the early parts of my trip, before the nightmare had begun. Without photographic proof, I knew no one would believe what I had experienced. The walk out of the canyon and back toward the main trail was a surreal experience. The forest had returned to normal, filled with the usual sounds and movements of a healthy ecosystem. It was as if the creatures had never existed, as if the past 3 days had been nothing more than an elaborate hallucination brought on by isolation and stress. But the physical evidence was undeniable. The claw marks on my tent, the enormous footprints around my campsite, the tree markings that had been carved too high for any known animal. All of it was real and documented in my photographs. Whatever those creatures were, they had left proof of their existence scattered throughout their territory. The hike back to my truck took most of the day, and with every step, the experience felt more and more like a dream. In the rational world of highways and cell phone service, it became increasingly difficult to believe that such creatures could exist undiscovered in the modern world. Yet the evidence was there, stored in my camera and burned into my memory. I drove home in a daze, my mind struggling to process what I had experienced. The comfortable familiarity of civilization felt alien after my encounter with something that existed outside the boundaries of accepted reality. Traffic lights and strip malls seemed like elaborate stage sets, artificial constructs that had no relevance to the primal truth I had discovered in the deep forest. The physical recovery from my ordeal took weeks. The scratches and bruises healed, my sleep patterns gradually returned to normal, and the hypervigilance that had kept me jumping at every unexpected sound slowly faded away. But the psychological impact lingered, coloring every aspect of my life with the knowledge that the world contained mysteries far more profound and terrifying than I had ever imagined. I developed the photographs from my trip, studying every image for details I might have missed. The footprints were clear and undeniable. The claw marks on trees showed obvious intelligence in their placement and pattern. But without images of the creatures themselves, I knew I could never convince anyone of what I had experienced. I researched everything I could find about similar encounters, delving into folklore, anthropological studies, and the accounts of other people who claim to have seen things that shouldn't exist. The stories were remarkably consistent across different times and cultures, describing creatures that matched what I had encountered, but which science insisted were impossible. The isolation was perhaps the hardest part to bear. How do you tell friends and family that you've encountered something that challenges every assumption about the natural world? How do you explain that there are intelligent creatures living in the deep forest, creatures that possess technology and social organization, but which have remained hidden from human civilization. I tried to return to my normal life, but the passion for wilderness photography that had driven me for years had been fundamentally altered. Every forest now seemed to hold the potential for encounters with things that might be better left undisturbed. The solitude I had once craved now felt dangerous, filled with unknown watchers who might not be as tolerant of human intrusion as the creatures I had encountered. Months passed before I felt ready to venture into the wilderness again, and when I did, it was with a group of other photographers and on well-traveled trails that stayed close to civilization. The deep forests remained off-limits, their shadows holding too many possibilities for encounters I was not prepared to face again. But sometimes, in the quiet hours of early morning or late evening, I would find myself studying topographical maps and wondering what other secrets the wilderness might hold. The rational part of my mind knew I should be grateful for my escape and content to leave those mysteries unsolved. Yet there was another part of me, a part that had been awakened by my encounter with the impossible, that wondered what other truths might be waiting in the places where humans rarely venture. The nightmares began about a month after I returned from the forest. They were vivid and detailed, featuring the intelligent eyes and massive forms of the creatures I had encountered. Sometimes I would dream I was back in that canyon, trapped and helpless while they decided my fate. Other times, the dreams would place them in familiar settings. My backyard, the parking lot outside my apartment, the aisles of the grocery store where I shopped. What made the dreams particularly disturbing was their consistency. The creatures always appeared exactly as I remembered them, down to the smallest details of their appearance and behavior. My subconscious mind wasn't embellishing or distorting the memories. It was simply replaying them with perfect accuracy, forcing me to relive the terror over and over again. I began to dread falling asleep, knowing that rest would bring no peace but only a return to that nightmare landscape, where impossible things stalked through the shadows. The lack of quality sleep began to affect every aspect of my life, making it difficult to concentrate at work and causing me to withdraw from social interactions that had once brought me pleasure. My photography business suffered as I found myself unable to maintain the enthusiasm and focus that professional work required. Clients began to notice the change in the quality of my work, and several projects were canceled when I failed to deliver images that met their expectations. The financial stress only added to my psychological burden, creating a downward spiral that seemed impossible to escape. I tried to discuss my experience with a few close friends, but their reactions ranged from polite skepticism to outright dismissal. One suggested I see a therapist, implying that the stress of solo wilderness travel had caused me to have some kind of psychological break. Another laughed it off as an overactive imagination, suggesting I had been watching too many horror movies. The most painful reaction came from my brother, a wildlife biologist who had always supported my photography work. When I showed him the photographs of the footprints and claw marks, he examined them with professional skepticism before offering a series of rational explanations. The footprints were hoax tracks made by someone with modified boots, he said. The claw marks were probably made by a bear reaching up to mark territory, with the height distorted by my emotional state. His dismissal hurt more than the others because I had hoped his scientific background would lend credibility to my claims. Instead, his expertise only served to reinforce how impossible my story sounded to rational minds. I stopped trying to convince anyone and began to wonder if perhaps they were right. Maybe I had experienced some kind of breakdown that had caused me to imagine things that never really happened. But the physical evidence wouldn't let me dismiss the experience so easily. The scratches on my tent were real. The photographs of the footprints were clear and detailed, and the precise measurements I had taken of the claw marks in the trees provided concrete data that couldn't be explained away by psychological stress. I began to research the area where I had encountered the creatures, diving deep into historical records and geological surveys. What I found was disturbing in its consistency. The region had a long history of unexplained disappearances dating back over a century. Hikers, hunters, and even trained search and rescue personnel had vanished without a trace in those deep woods. Native American tribes in the area had legends about the forest that matched my experience with unsettling accuracy. They spoke of ancient guardians who protected the deep woods from human intrusion, beings of immense size and intelligence who would tolerate human presence only to a point. The tribal elders I managed to contact were reluctant to discuss the legends in detail, but their expressions when I mentioned my experience suggested they knew exactly what I was talking about. I found myself drawn back to the edges of that wilderness area, driving the mountain roads that bordered the region where I had encountered the creatures. I never ventured back into the forest itself, but I would park at overlooks and scan the tree line with binoculars, looking for any sign of movement that might confirm that my experience had been real. On several occasions, I thought I glimpsed something moving in the distant forest. Dark shapes that seemed too large and moved in patterns that didn't match any known wildlife. But the distance was too great to be certain, and the rational part of my mind insisted that I was seeing only what I wanted to see, projecting my memories onto innocent shadows and normal forest activity. The isolation became overwhelming. Unable to share my experience with anyone who would believe me, I began to feel like I was carrying a burden too heavy for one person to bear. The knowledge that such creatures existed, that they lived just beyond the boundaries of human civilization, felt like a secret that was slowly destroying me from within. I started attending support groups for people who had experienced traumatic events, but I could never bring myself to share the specific details of what had happened to me. How could I tell a room full of accident survivors and crime victims that I had been terrorized by creatures that science insisted didn't exist? My story would sound like the ravings of someone who had lost touch with reality. The anniversary of my encounter approached with the inevitability of a death sentence. As the date grew closer, my anxiety levels increased dramatically. I found myself unable to sleep for more than a few hours at a time, and when I did sleep, the dreams were more vivid and terrifying than ever. The creatures seemed to be calling to me, drawing me back to their domain for reasons I couldn't understand. 3 days before the anniversary, I made a decision that terrified me but felt unavoidable. I would return to the forest, not to seek out another encounter, but to prove to myself that the creatures were real and that my experience had been more than just a psychological breakdown. I needed evidence that would convince others, documentation that would validate what I had endured. I prepared for the trip with obsessive care, checking and rechecking every piece of equipment. This time I brought multiple cameras, including several with motion-activated triggers that could capture images even when I wasn't present. I packed extra batteries, memory cards, and backup equipment for everything critical to the mission. The drive to the trailhead was surreal, every mile bringing back memories of my previous journey and the terror that had followed. But alongside the fear was a strange sense of anticipation, almost relief, at the prospect of finally obtaining proof of what I had experienced. If I could document the creature's existence, perhaps I could finally share the burden of this knowledge with others. I parked at the same trailhead where my nightmare had begun exactly 1 year earlier. The forest looked identical, but my perception of it had been forever changed. Where I had once seen beauty and tranquility, I now saw potential danger lurking behind every tree. The shadows seemed deeper, the silence more ominous, the very air charged with possibilities I didn't want to contemplate. As I shouldered my pack and started down the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking back into the mouth of some vast predator, voluntarily placing myself in danger that any rational person would avoid. But the need for validation, for proof that would silence the doubts that had plagued me for an entire year, drove me forward into the green darkness of the ancient forest. The trees closed around me like the walls of a prison, and I realized that regardless of what I found on this journey, I would never be the same person who had emerged from these woods a year ago. The innocent photographer who had come here seeking beautiful images was gone forever, replaced by someone who knew that the world contained mysteries far darker and more dangerous than most people could ever imagine. But as terrifying as that knowledge was, it was also liberating in a way. I was no longer constrained by the comfortable assumptions of civilized life. I had seen beyond the veil of ordinary reality, and that vision, however frightening, had shown me truths that most people would never experience. Whether I survived this return journey or not, I would face whatever waited in the deep woods with eyes wide open and a heart that, despite everything, still beat with the courage to seek truth in the darkest corners of the unknown. The forest welcomed me back with the same deceptive beauty that had first drawn me to this place. But now I knew what lay beneath that beautiful facade. Somewhere in these ancient trees, intelligence watched and waited, measuring my progress and deciding once again what to do with the human who had dared to return to their domain. This time, however, I was ready for them. This time, I would not leave without proof of their existence, no matter what the cost might be. I never considered myself particularly outdoorsy growing up. As a kid in suburban Philadelphia, my idea of roughing it was camping in the backyard with a tablet full of movies. But college changed that. I met Marcus during freshman orientation at Penn State. He was the one who first got me into hiking. Something about his enthusiasm was infectious. While other students spent weekends at parties, Marcus would drag me out to local trails, teaching me about native plants and wildlife. Over the next 4 years, what started as occasional hikes became a full-blown passion. I joined the university's hiking club, learned wilderness survival basics, and spent most breaks exploring the Appalachian Trail. There was something therapeutic about disconnecting from technology and just existing in nature. The physical challenge, the quiet moments watching sunlight filter through leaves, the camaraderie around campfires, it all filled a void I hadn't known existed in my life. After graduation, when most of my friends scattered across the country for jobs, hiking became my way of staying grounded. I'd meet up with local hiking groups, making new friends who shared my love of the outdoors. Sarah and Mike, a couple I met through a Facebook hiking group, became regular adventure partners. We'd plan weekend trips, pushing ourselves to explore more challenging trails and remote locations. By 2009, I had a solid reputation in the local hiking community. I'd logged hundreds of miles on trails across the Northeast, led group expeditions, and even started a blog documenting my adventures. But familiarity can breed complacency. When you've hiked enough trails, you start thinking you know what to expect. You stop believing in the warnings about going off trail. You convince yourself that your experience makes you immune to the dangers that claim less seasoned hikers. That hubris nearly cost me everything. The Allegheny National Forest had been on my radar for months. Sarah had mentioned an old logging trail that supposedly led to a hidden waterfall, the kind of spot that doesn't show up on official maps. We spent weeks planning the expedition, poring over topographical maps and satellite imagery. Mike, with his background in geology, helped us identify likely water features and terrain patterns that might indicate our target. I threw myself into research, reading old Forest Service reports and local hiking forums. A few posts mentioned strange experiences in that area, unexplained noises, unusual animal behavior, hikers feeling watched. I dismissed them as campfire stories. Every wilderness area has its local legends after all. Our gear preparation was methodical. I'd learned from experience that being under-equipped in remote areas could be fatal. My pack contained a high-end GPS unit with extra batteries, topographical maps and compass, first aid kit with wilderness medical supplies, 3 days of dehydrated meals, water filtration system, emergency shelter, satellite phone for emergencies, bear spray, multiple light sources, fire starting materials. The weather forecast showed clear skies and mild temperatures, perfect hiking conditions. Everything seemed aligned for an ideal expedition. We started at dawn on a crisp September morning. The forest was stunning, old-growth hardwoods towering overhead, their leaves just beginning to hint at fall colors. The main trail was well maintained, winding through stands of ancient hemlocks and across crystal-clear streams. Sarah pointed out interesting flora as we hiked: ghost pipe growing in dark corners, patches of wild ginger, clusters of jack-in-the-pulpit. Mike kept us entertained with facts about the region's geological history, explaining how glaciers had carved the landscape millions of years ago. The first few hours were exactly what we'd hoped for. We maintained a steady pace, stopping occasionally to photograph particularly scenic spots or examine interesting mushrooms. The forest felt alive but peaceful. Birds calling overhead, squirrels chattering in the branches, the soft crunch of leaves under our boots. Looking back, I should have noticed when things began to change. It was subtle at first, the bird songs growing fewer and farther between, the quality of light shifting despite the clear sky. But we were focused on finding our turn-off point, the old logging trail that would lead us to the waterfall. When we finally spotted it, barely more than a game trail now, we paused to check our position. The GPS signal was weak, but our map suggested we were on track. Mike seemed hesitant, mentioning something about the rock formations not matching his expectations. Sarah was eager to press on. I made the call to continue. That decision would haunt me for years to come. About 2 miles down the old logging trail, we found the first sign that something was wrong. The path opened into a small clearing, and there, hanging from a low branch, was a backpack. Not unusual in itself. Hikers sometimes cache supplies, but this one was shredded, its contents scattered across the forest floor. The tears didn't look like animal damage or normal wear. They were too precise, too deliberate. Sarah wanted to turn back immediately. Mike suggested we at least document the site and report it to the rangers. As I approached the backpack to check for identification, I noticed strange markings on the surrounding trees. They looked like claw marks, but they were too high up, 8 or 9 feet off the ground, and they formed patterns, almost like symbols. The air felt different in that clearing, heavy, static, like just before a thunderstorm. Our phones showed no signal, and the GPS was completely dead despite the fresh batteries. Even the compass was acting strange, the needle spinning randomly instead of pointing north. As we debated what to do, we heard it. A sound that didn't belong in these woods, like metal scraping against stone, but with an organic quality that made my skin crawl. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Instead of retreating, we made another fatal error. We tried to locate the source of the sound. The logging trail had become nearly invisible, choked with undergrowth that seemed to grab at our clothes and equipment. The trees pressed closer together, their branches forming a canopy so dense that it felt like twilight despite being early afternoon. The temperature dropped noticeably as we pushed forward. Our breath began fogging in the air. The forest floor was covered in a thick layer of dead leaves, but they made no sound when we walked on them. It was as if the woods were absorbing all noise. We found more signs of something. Broken branches that would have required immense strength to snap. Deep gouges in the earth that looked fresh but contained no tracks. And most disturbing, small piles of bones, too clean to be natural kills, arranged in geometric patterns that seemed to point deeper into the forest. Mike was filming everything on his phone, trying to maintain some scientific detachment. Sarah had gone quiet, her earlier enthusiasm replaced by rigid alertness. I kept telling myself there had to be a logical explanation, even as every instinct screamed at me to run. It happened so fast. One moment we were documenting another set of strange markings. The next, the forest exploded into motion. The scraping sound returned, deafening now, accompanied by a smell like rotting leaves and copper. The shadows between the trees seemed to writhe and coalesce. What stepped out of those shadows? I've spent years trying to find words to describe it. The closest I can come is this. Imagine something that understood the general concept of deer, but had only seen one in a nightmare. It moved on too many legs, its skin a patchwork of bark and fur and things I couldn't identify. Its head was adorned with antlers that seemed to shift and change when viewed directly, and its eyes. Mike screamed. The sound seemed to trigger something in the creature. It moved with impossible speed, closing the distance between us in a heartbeat. Sarah fired her bear spray, but the cloud passed through it as if it were made of smoke. What followed was a desperate flight through the darkening forest. We crashed through underbrush, vaulted fallen logs, splashed through icy streams. The creature pursued us with an almost playful leisure, herding us like prey, occasionally letting out sounds that might have been laughter. I lost my pack somewhere in the chaos. Sarah twisted her ankle but kept running on pure adrenaline. Mike was filming even as we fled, his hands shaking so badly I doubted the footage would show anything useful. We finally burst out onto the main trail as dusk was falling. The creature didn't follow us into the open, but its presence lingered at the edge of the forest like a physical weight. We didn't stop running until we reached the parking lot. The immediate aftermath was a blur of ranger stations, police reports, and hospital visits. Sarah's ankle was severely sprained. Mike had deep scratches on his back that none of us remembered him receiving. I was treated for exposure and shock. The rangers found my pack the next day, right at the start of the logging trail. The footage on Mike's phone was corrupted, just static and bizarre audio distortions. Our GPS units and phones showed no record of our detour, as if those hours had never happened. The nightmares started almost immediately, not just reliving the experience, but variations on it. Sometimes I'm alone in those woods watching the shadows move. Sometimes I'm the one being watched. I wake up with the taste of copper in my mouth and the feeling of bark under my fingers. In the months that followed, I became obsessed with researching similar incidents. I found patterns in missing persons reports from the area, clusters of disappearances every few decades, always in the same general region, local folklore about woodwalkers and forest guardians that seemed to predate European settlement. Sarah refused to talk about what happened, eventually cutting contact with both Mike and me. Mike threw himself into analyzing what evidence we had, starting a podcast about unexplained phenomena in national parks. He sent me updates sometimes, other hikers reporting similar experiences, strange marks found on trees, unexplained sounds recorded in the forest. It's been 15 years since that day in the Allegheny National Forest. I still hike, but never alone, and never off marked trails. I've learned to respect the wilderness in a way I never did before, not just as a place of beauty and challenge, but as something ancient and unknowable. Sometimes, on dark nights when I can't sleep, I find myself looking at satellite images of those woods, tracing possible paths to that clearing. Part of me wants to go back, to prove to myself that what we encountered has a rational explanation, but a bigger part knows better. The forest keeps its secrets. Some trails are meant to stay untraveled. And sometimes the most important lesson nature can teach us is the wisdom of turning back. I've never shared this story publicly before. If you're planning to hike in the Allegheny National Forest, stick to marked trails. If you hear metal scraping against stone, run. And if you feel watched, you probably are. I've always been drawn to the wilderness. Growing up in Sacramento, I spent my weekends exploring the Sierra Nevadas with my father, learning the ways of the forest before I could even read. He taught me how to track animals, identify edible plants, and most importantly, how to respect nature's power. Those early experiences shaped me into who I am today, or at least who I was before that day in Shasta Trinity. By my early 30s, I had built a comfortable life as an environmental consultant, but something was missing. The fluorescent lights and endless meetings left me feeling hollow. My colleagues couldn't understand why I'd spend my vacation days solo hiking instead of lounging on beaches. But those who've felt the call of the wilderness know there's something primal about being alone in nature, something that speaks to the deepest parts of our soul. I found my community in the Northern California Hiking Association. Every month we'd tackle a new trail, share stories around campfires, and plan bigger adventures. That's where I met Tom and Linda, the rangers who would later become entangled in my story. They were regulars at our meetings, offering insights about trail conditions and sharing tales of their most memorable rescues. If only we'd known then what lurked in the shadows of their jurisdiction. Looking back, I should have noticed the way their expressions would tighten when certain areas of the forest were mentioned. How they'd subtly steer groups away from the deeper, older parts of Shasta Trinity. But like most warning signs, these only became clear in hindsight. The summer of 2014 was particularly rough at work. A major project had fallen through, and the stress was crushing. When August came around, I knew I needed more than just a weekend escape. I needed real solitude, time to reset and reconnect with myself. The NCHA members suggested various spots, but something drew me to a remote area of Shasta Trinity that Tom had once briefly mentioned. Though now I remember he'd quickly changed the subject. I had no way of knowing that this decision would unravel everything I thought I knew about the natural world. That it would expose me to something that defied explanation, something that had been haunting these woods long before the first settlers arrived. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start with that first day, when the forest still felt like a sanctuary rather than a prison. The planning began 2 weeks before my departure. I spent hours poring over topographical maps, marking potential camping spots near the small unnamed lake Tom had mentioned. My old RV, a '95 Winnebago that had seen better days, would serve as base camp. I meticulously checked every system: engine, water, electrical. Looking back, I wonder if my thoroughness was intuition trying to warn me. The supply list grew longer each day. Beyond the usual camping gear, I packed extra everything: batteries, first aid supplies, emergency rations. Something kept nagging at me to be over-prepared. I even threw in my grandfather's old hunting knife, though I'd never needed it before. The blade was still sharp, the leather handle worn smooth from years of use. I researched the area's history, finding only sparse information. The Forest Service records mentioned routine incidents: lost hikers, minor accidents, wildlife encounters. But searching deeper, I found old newspaper clippings about disappearances dating back to the 1800s. Most were dismissed as people wandering off trail or animal attacks. None mentioned what I would eventually encounter. The Native American history of the region was particularly interesting, and in retrospect, telling. The local tribes spoke of areas that were forbidden, places where the veil between worlds was thin. They had names for things that lived in the deepest parts of the forest, things that hungered. I dismissed these as folklore, the kind of stories every wilderness area collects over time. I know better now. That first morning in Shasta Trinity dawned clear and cool. The lake was mirror smooth, reflecting the towering conifers like a perfect photograph. Mist clung to the water's surface, creating ethereal shapes that danced and dissolved in the early light. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, clean in a way city air never is. The first 2 days were idyllic. I'd wake with the sun, fish for my breakfast, and spend hours reading or simply watching the wildlife. Birds would come right up to my campsite: chickadees, jays, even a curious woodpecker. In the evenings, I'd sit by the fire and watch stars emerge in a sky untainted by light pollution. The solitude felt therapeutic, exactly what I'd been seeking. But subtle changes began on the third day. The birdsong grew less frequent. The small animals that had been scurrying around my campsite disappeared. At first, I rationalized it: weather changes, natural cycles. But there was something else. A heaviness in the air that hadn't been there before. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It felt expectant, like the forest was holding its breath. I started finding strange markings on trees, not the usual scratches from bears or other wildlife, but deliberate patterns that seemed to point deeper into the forest. The rational part of my mind said they were probably trail markers, but they didn't match any system I'd ever encountered. And they seemed fresh, as if they'd been carved while I slept. That's when I decided to explore further inland, away from the lake. I told myself it was curiosity, but looking back, I think something was drawing me in, like a fish being slowly reeled toward the surface. The trail I followed wasn't on any of my maps, but it was clear enough, too clear, really, for how remote this area was supposed to be. The old cabin appeared so suddenly, it seemed to materialize from the forest itself. One moment I was pushing through dense undergrowth, the next I was standing in a small clearing, facing a structure that had no business being there. The wood was weathered gray, the windows dark and empty. No moss grew on the roof, no vines climbed the walls, as if nothing dared to touch it. Inside, the air was thick with decay, yet strangely cold. Dust motes danced in the beams of light that penetrated the gloom, but they moved wrong, swirling in patterns that defied the still air. The furniture was primitive but intact. No rot, no damage from animals or weather. Just a thick layer of dust that bore no footprints but my own. The journal I found sat on a crude table, its leather cover unmarked by age. The pages were filled with cramped handwriting, the ink still dark despite its apparent age. As I read, my hands began to shake. The writer described things that couldn't exist, shapes that moved in impossible ways, sounds that drove listeners to madness, and always, the name, Narga. But it was what I found beneath the floorboards that truly terrified me. A trapdoor, hidden under a ragged rug, led to a root cellar. The beam of my flashlight revealed walls covered in symbols similar to the tree markings, but these were drawn in something dark and flaking. Scattered across the dirt floor were objects I still struggle to describe, things that looked organic but wrong, like pieces of creatures that never should have existed. The smart thing would have been to leave immediately, to run back to my RV and never look back. Instead, I found myself following more of those carved symbols, deeper into the forest. The trees grew older here, their trunks massive and gnarled. The canopy above became so dense that little sunlight penetrated, creating a perpetual twilight. The air grew thicker, harder to breathe. Sounds became distorted. My footsteps seemed to echo too long. The rustle of leaves didn't quite match the movement of branches. I began finding more evidence that something was terribly wrong. Claw marks too high up on trees for any known animal, patches of ground where nothing grew, and most disturbing, what looked like pieces of camping equipment, shredded and scattered as if something had played with them. Then I found the other campsites. 3 of them, spread across what might have been a mile. Each told a similar story of sudden departure, or worse. Tents were torn from the inside out, sleeping bags shredded, personal belongings scattered. But it was the blood that turned my fear into terror. Not just spots or stains, but patterns, deliberate arrangements that seemed to point towards something I couldn't quite comprehend. The creature found me as the day was fading. I heard it before I saw it. A sound like wet leather being stretched and torn, accompanied by a clicking that reminded me of a giant insect. The forest had gone completely silent, the air so still it hurt to breathe. Even the wind seemed to have fled. What emerged from between the trees defied description, but I'll try. It moved like smoke but had mass, its form constantly shifting, yet somehow maintaining a vague humanoid shape. Where a face should have been, there was only a void darker than the deepest cave, ringed by what looked like teeth but moved like fingers. The sight of it felt wrong, like my mind was trying to reject what my eyes were seeing. The chase that followed exists in my memory as a series of fractured images, running through darkness that seemed alive, branches reaching for me like claws. The thing behind me making sounds that human ears were never meant to hear. I remember falling, scrambling through mud, my lungs burning as I pushed myself beyond exhaustion. Every time I looked back, it was closer, moving in ways that ignored physical laws. It didn't run so much as flow, each movement liquid and precise. The air around it shimmered like heat waves, and where it passed, frost formed on the trees despite the summer warmth. I don't remember reaching the ranger station. Tom later told me I had burst through the door, clothes torn and covered in mud, babbling about shadows that moved wrong and teeth in the darkness. I had a fever of 104 and scratches all over my body that the doctors couldn't explain. They looked like claw marks but didn't match any known animal. The next few days passed in a blur of doctors, police interviews, and ranger reports. I learned that 3 other hikers had gone missing in the same area over the past month. Search parties found nothing except more of those strange symbols carved into trees, leading nowhere. My RV was recovered, but the engine problem that had stranded me couldn't be replicated. The mechanic said everything was in perfect working order. The physical injuries healed quickly, too quickly, according to the doctors. But the psychological trauma lingered. I couldn't sleep without lights on. The darkness seemed to move in ways it shouldn't. Even in my apartment in the city, I would wake up certain that something was watching me through the windows, pressing against the glass with a body made of shadow. The nightmares started about a week after I returned home. They're always the same. I'm back in those woods, but the trees are wrong, twisted into impossible shapes. The thing is there, always just out of sight, calling to me in a voice that sounds like my own. I wake up with that name on my lips. Narga. My life changed in fundamental ways. I couldn't work in my old office. The fluorescent lights reminded me too much of the strange luminescence I'd seen in the forest. I transferred to a remote position, working from home where I could control my environment. My relationships suffered. How do you explain to friends that you can't go camping anymore because you've seen something that shouldn't exist? I tried to research what had happened to me. I found others who had similar experiences in different forests around the world. They all described the same elements: the symbols, the cold, the creature that moved like smoke. Some had theories about ancient entities that existed before humans, things that lived in the spaces between what we consider reality. Others suggested more scientific explanations: temporal anomalies, undiscovered predators, mass hallucinations. None of the explanations fully fit what I had experienced. Strange things continued to happen in the months that followed. I'd find those symbols drawn in the condensation on my bathroom mirror, only to have them disappear when I looked again. Electronics would malfunction around me, especially at night. I'd wake up to find my phone had recorded hours of static, or my laptop had filled pages with random characters that, when printed, seemed to form familiar patterns. Tom and Linda kept in touch, sending updates about the ongoing investigation. More people had gone missing in the same area, despite increased patrols. The Forest Service eventually closed that section of Shasta Trinity, citing environmental concerns. But we all knew the real reason. I started receiving emails from others who had survived similar encounters. We formed a loose network, sharing information and theories. Some had seen the creature in the Carpathian Mountains, others in the forests of Pacific Northwest or the Amazon. The details varied, but the core experience was always the same: the sense of being hunted by something that shouldn't exist. 10 years have passed since my encounter in Shasta Trinity. I've learned to live with the memory, though it's changed me in ways I'm still discovering. I no longer see the wilderness as a place of solace. Instead, I understand it as the ancients did, as something vast and unknowable, hiding things we weren't meant to comprehend. The nightmares have faded, but I still can't shake the feeling that my encounter wasn't random. That thing, the Narga, it chose me for a reason. Sometimes, in the moments between sleeping and waking, I think I understand why. But that understanding slips away like smoke when I try to grasp it, leaving only a lingering sense of something vast and patient, waiting in the shadows of the forest. I still have the journal I found in the cabin. The rangers never asked for it, and I never volunteered its existence. Sometimes, late at night, I take it out and read random passages. the writer's descent into understanding mirrors my own experience too closely to be coincidence. The last entry, dated 1947, haunts me. It's not that it follows us. It's that it's always been here, waiting for us to notice. And once you see it, it never stops seeing you. I share this story not to frighten, but to warn. There are places in this world where reality wears thin, where things slip through from somewhere else. If you find yourself in such a place, if you feel that weight of ancient attention falling upon you, don't do what I did. Don't let curiosity override your instincts. Run. Run as fast and as far as you can. Because sometimes, the most terrifying truth isn't that monsters exist. It's that they've always been here, watching and waiting, and we're only now beginning to glimpse their shadows. I never thought I'd be telling this story. Hell, I never thought I'd live to tell it. But here I am, sitting in my weather-beaten cabin, pen scratching against paper as I try to make sense of what happened that day in the deep woods of Evergreen County. The name's Jack Hawthorne, and I've been living out here in the backwoods for nigh on 20 years now. Got myself a little slice of heaven, or so I thought, tucked away in these ancient forests. My nearest neighbor's a good 5 miles down a winding dirt road, and that suits me just fine. Always been more comfortable with the company of trees than people, if you know what I mean. It was late October when it all went down. The kind of autumn day that can't quite decide if it wants to be winter yet. The air was crisp, carrying that unmistakable scent of decaying leaves and wood smoke. I remember waking up that morning, bones creaking like the old floorboards of my cabin. The world outside my window was painted in shades of gray, the sky a dull slate that promised rain later. I pulled myself out of bed, shrugging on my old red and black checkered flannel, the one with more patches than original fabric at this point. My work pants, faded and worn, had seen better days, but they were comfortable and sturdy. I laced up my battered work boots, the leather cracked but still holding strong. Those boots had been with me longer than my last dog, rest his soul. Breakfast was a simple affair, strong black coffee and a couple of fried eggs. As I ate, I gazed out the window at the woodpile. It was getting low. Winter was coming, and out here, you don't take chances with the cold. I finished my coffee, rinsed the mug, and headed outside. The air hit me like a slap to the face, cold and damp. I could see my breath hanging in front of me as I made my way to the shed where I keep my tools. The old axe was right where I'd left it, leaning against the weathered wood. I hefted it, feeling the familiar weight in my hands. The handle was smooth from years of use, fitting my grip like it was made for me. I set to work, the rhythmic thud of the axe against wood echoing through the silent forest. Swing, split, stack, swing, split, stack. It was mindless work, the kind that lets your thoughts wander. I found myself thinking about the upcoming winter, mentally cataloging supplies I'd need to stock up on next time I made the long drive into town. By midday, I had a decent pile of firewood ready. My arms ached, a good kind of burn that comes from honest work. I paused, wiping the sweat from my brow with the back of my hand. That's when I heard it. At first, I thought it was just a branch snapping under the weight of a squirrel, or maybe a deer. But then it came again. Louder, closer. There was something off about the sound. It wasn't the casual snap of wildlife moving through the underbrush. This was deliberate, heavy. I've lived in these woods long enough to know when something's not right. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I tightened my grip on the axe. My eyes scanned the tree line, searching for movement. That's when I saw it. At first it was just a shadow, a darker patch among the trees. But as I focused, I realized it was something else. Something that didn't belong. It was tall, far taller than any man I'd ever seen. Its body was covered in thick, matted fur that seemed to shift and writhe in the dim light. But it was the way it moved that really got to me. Each step was jerky, unnatural, like its joints weren't quite in the right places. I called out, my voice sounding thin and weak in the suddenly oppressive silence of the forest. "Hey, who's there?" No response, just that eerie stillness. I took a step forward, axe held ready. The thing, because I couldn't bring myself to call it a person, twitched. Its massive head snapped in my direction, and I swear I could feel its gaze boring into me. That's when it let out a sound that'll haunt me till the day I die. It was a roar, but not like any animal I'd ever heard. It was deep, guttural, and filled with a kind of primal rage that sent ice through my veins. And then it charged. I'd like to say I stood my ground, that I faced the thing down with nothing but my axe and my courage. But that'd be a lie. I ran. I ran like I've never run before in my life. The axe fell from my hands as I bolted for the cabin. I could hear it behind me, crashing through the underbrush. Each thunderous footfall felt like it was right at my heels. Branches whipped at my face. Roots seemed to reach up to trip me, but I didn't slow down. I couldn't. My lungs were burning, every breath a ragged gasp. The cabin seemed impossibly far away. But then, like a miracle, I saw it. The old woodpile, and beyond it, the familiar slanted roof of my home. I hit the porch at full speed, nearly taking the door off its hinges as I burst inside. I slammed it shut behind me, fumbling with the old bolt lock. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely manage it. Outside, I heard the creature crash into the woodpile. Logs went scattering, and another of those bone-chilling roars shook the very walls of the cabin. I stumbled back from the door, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. For a moment, all I could do was stand there, gasping for breath, ears straining for any sound of movement outside. Then, slowly, I crept to the window. Peering through a crack in the worn curtains, I saw it. The creature was circling the cabin, its massive form a dark silhouette against the gray sky. Its arms, if you could call them that, hung nearly to the ground, ending in wickedly curved claws that looked like they could tear through the cabin's wooden walls like paper. As I watched, it reared up, slamming those claws into the side of the cabin. The whole structure shook, and I heard wood splintering. It wouldn't take long for it to break through. My mind raced. What the hell was this thing? In all my years in these woods, I'd never seen anything like it. Sure, there were always stories. Old tales told by drunks at the bar in town. Campfire stories meant to scare kids. But this was real. And it was trying to kill me. I needed a weapon. My eyes fell on the old shotgun mounted above the fireplace. It was more of a decoration these days, a relic from my younger hunting days. But it still worked. At least, I hoped it did. Moving as quietly as I could, I retrieved the gun and a handful of shells from a drawer. My hands were shaking as I loaded it, the sound of each shell sliding into place seeming impossibly loud in the quiet cabin. Another crash from outside. More splintering wood. I didn't have much time. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. Then, in one swift motion, I yanked open the door and stepped outside. The creature was there, its massive back turned to me as it clawed at the side of the cabin. At the sound of the door, it whirled around, fixing me with eyes that glowed with an unnatural amber light. For a split second, we just stared at each other. I saw intelligence in those eyes, a cold, alien sort of awareness that chilled me to my core. Then it lunged. I fired. The blast was deafening in the quiet forest. The creature staggered, letting out a howl of pain and rage. But it didn't go down. I fired again, the recoil slamming into my shoulder. This time the thing stumbled back. Dark, viscous fluid oozed from its wounds. But still, it didn't fall. Instead, it fixed me with those glowing eyes one more time, let out another of those soul-shaking roars, and then it turned and ran. I watched, shotgun still raised, as it disappeared into the trees. The forest swallowed it up, leaving nothing but silence and the acrid smell of gunpowder hanging in the air. For a long moment, I just stood there, my ears ringing, trying to process what had just happened. Then, slowly, the adrenaline began to fade, and I started to shake. I stumbled back into the cabin, slamming and locking the door behind me. I spent the rest of that day and night huddled in a corner, shotgun clutched to my chest, jumping at every sound. But the creature didn't return. When dawn finally broke, I ventured outside. The damage to the cabin was extensive. Deep gouges in the wood, the porch steps smashed to kindling. And there, in the soft earth, were the tracks. Massive, misshapen prints that sank deep into the ground. Proof that it hadn't all been some sort of fever dream. I didn't waste any time. I threw some clothes and supplies in my old pickup and hightailed it into town. Went straight to the ranger station and told them everything. They didn't believe me at first, of course. Can't say I blame them. It sounded crazy, even to my own ears. But when they came out to the cabin and saw the damage, the tracks, well, let's just say their tune changed pretty quick. Word spread fast after that. The town was in an uproar. Experts came from all over, poking around in the woods, taking casts of the prints. News crews showed up, eager for a story about the Evergreen County monster. But they never found it. Oh, there were more sightings over the next few weeks. Hikers reporting glimpses of something massive moving through the trees. More tracks found deep in the forest. But no one ever got a clear look at the thing. Eventually, the excitement died down. The experts packed up and left. The news crews found other stories to chase. Life in Evergreen County slowly returned to normal. But not for me. I know what I saw that day. I know what's out there in those woods. These days, I keep the shotgun close at hand. I've reinforced the cabin, added extra locks. And at night, when the wind howls through the trees and shadows move outside my windows, I lie awake, listening, waiting. Because I know the truth. There are things in this world we don't understand. Things that lurk in the dark places, just beyond the edge of civilization. And sometimes, if we're not careful, we might just stumble upon them. So if you ever find yourself in the backwoods of Evergreen County, keep your eyes open and your wits about you. Because you never know what might be watching from the shadows. And take it from me, some legends are best left undisturbed. Some legends are best left undisturbed. But of course, that's not where the story ends. Life has a funny way of throwing curveballs, even when you think you've seen it all. It was about 3 months after my encounter when things started getting weird again. Winter had set in hard, blanketing the woods in a thick layer of snow. The days were short, the nights long and bitter cold. I'd settled into a routine of sorts, chopping wood, tending the fire, and keeping a watchful eye on the tree line. One particularly frigid evening, I was sitting by the fire, nursing a cup of coffee laced with a generous splash of whiskey. The wind was howling outside, rattling the windows and making the cabin creak and groan. I was just about to turn in for the night when I heard it. A long, low howl that cut through the wind like a knife. At first, I tried to convince myself it was just the wind playing tricks. But then it came again, closer this time. My blood ran cold. I knew that sound. It was the same bone-chilling roar I'd heard months ago. I grabbed my shotgun and moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. The world outside was a swirling mess of white, the snow coming down so hard I could barely see past the porch. But there, just at the edge of my vision, I saw movement. A massive, dark shape lumbering through the storm. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear anything else. I watched, frozen in place, as the shape drew closer. It paused at the edge of the clearing, and for a moment, I swore those glowing amber eyes were staring right at me. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone, swallowed up by the storm. I didn't sleep a wink that night. I sat by the window, shotgun in hand, watching and waiting. But the creature didn't return. The next morning, I bundled up and ventured outside. The storm had passed, leaving behind a pristine blanket of white, And there, cutting through the snow, were the tracks. Massive misshapen prints leading right up to the edge of the clearing before veering off into the woods. I knew I should have called the rangers right then and there. But something held me back. Maybe it was fear, or maybe it was a growing sense of curiosity. Whatever the reason, I decided to keep this sighting to myself. At least for now. Over the next few weeks, the sightings continued. Always at night, always at the edge of the clearing. The creature never came closer, never tried to attack. It was almost like it was watching me. I started leaving food out. Just scraps at first, leftover stew, some jerky. Each morning, the plate would be licked clean. I told myself I was just trying to keep it from getting desperate enough to attack. But deep down, I knew there was more to it than that. As winter dragged on, I found myself looking forward to the nightly visits. I'd sit by the window, watching for that familiar shape in the darkness. Sometimes, when the night was clear and the moon was bright, I'd catch a glimpse of its face. It was still terrifying, all matted fur and glowing eyes. But there was something almost sad about it. It was on one of these nights, as I sat watching the creature lumber around the edge of the clearing, that I had a revelation. This thing, whatever it was alone. Just like me. Two outcasts, surviving on the fringes of a world that had no place for us. Spring came, melting away the snow and bringing new life to the forest. The nightly visits became less frequent, but they didn't stop entirely. I found myself looking forward to them, even missing the creature when it didn't show up for a few days. It was around this time that I started talking to it. Just simple stuff at first, commenting on the weather, complaining about my aching joints. I felt ridiculous, of course. For all I knew, the thing couldn't understand a word I was saying. But it felt good to have someone, or something, to talk to after all these years of solitude. One night, as I was rambling on about my plans to fix up the cabin, I could have sworn I saw the creature nod. It was just a slight movement, barely perceptible in the moonlight. But it was there. That's when things really started to change. I began leaving books out along with the food. Just simple stuff at first. Picture books, the kind you'd give to a kid. But as the weeks went by, I graduated to more complex texts. Field guides about local flora and fauna, history books, even some of my old philosophy texts from my brief stint in college. And the creature, well, it seemed to be reading them. I'd watch from the window as it carefully turned the pages with those massive clawed hands. Sometimes it would spend hours poring over a single book, its glowing eyes moving back and forth across the page. It was on a warm summer night, almost a year after our first violent encounter, that everything changed. I was sitting on the porch, enjoying the cool evening air, when I heard the familiar sound of heavy footsteps approaching. But this time, instead of staying at the edge of the clearing, the creature kept coming. My heart was in my throat as it lumbered up to the porch. This close, I could smell its musky, earthy scent. Could see the intelligence burning in those amber eyes. For a long moment, we just stared at each other. Then, slowly, deliberately, it reached out one massive hand. In its palm was a small, white flower. A trillium, one of the first blooms of spring. With trembling fingers, I took the offering. And as I looked up to meet its gaze, I saw something I never expected to see in those alien features. A smile. From that night on, our relationship changed. The creature, which I had started calling Buddy in my head, became a regular visitor. Not just at night, but during the day as well. We'd sit on the porch together, me talking, Buddy listening, and occasionally making gestures that I began to interpret as a form of communication. I learned that Buddy was incredibly intelligent. It, or perhaps he, though I was never quite sure, had an insatiable curiosity about the world. We'd spend hours looking through books together, with me explaining concepts and Buddy soaking it all in. But it wasn't all peaceful. there were still moments when Buddy's wild nature would shine through. Times when a sudden movement or loud noise would send him into a frenzy, his powerful limbs lashing out, those wicked claws leaving deep gouges in the wood of the porch. And there were the nightmares. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I'd be woken by heart-wrenching howls coming from the woods. On these nights, I'd find Buddy huddled at the edge of the clearing, shaking and whimpering like a wounded animal. It was after one of these episodes that I made a decision. I couldn't keep Buddy a secret any longer. He needed help. Real, professional help that I couldn't provide. And more than that, the world needed to know about him. Not as some monster to be feared, but as a sentient, intelligent being deserving of respect and protection. So, with a heavy heart, I picked up the phone and called the Rangers. Told them everything. About the initial attack, the nightly visits, the growing bond between us. They listened in silence, and when I was done, they said they'd be out first thing in the morning. That night, as Buddy and I sat on the porch watching the stars, I tried to explain what was going to happen. I don't know how much he understood, but as the first light of dawn started to creep over the horizon, he stood up and lumbered off into the woods. Somehow, I knew he wouldn't be back. The Rangers arrived a few hours later, along with a team of scientists and government officials. They combed the woods for days, but found no trace of Buddy beyond the tracks and claw marks around my cabin. In the years since, I've told this story countless times. To researchers, journalists, cryptozoologists, and anyone else who would listen. Some believe me, some don't. There have been other sightings over the years, reports of a large fur-covered creature roaming the deep woods, but nothing conclusive. As for me, I still live in my little cabin in the woods, still keep a watchful eye on the tree line. And every now and then, on quiet nights when the moon is full, I could swear I hear a familiar howl echoing through the trees. It serves as a reminder that there's still mystery in this world, that there are things out there beyond our understanding. And sometimes, if we're lucky, we get a glimpse of them. So if you find yourself in these woods, and you see something moving in the shadows, don't be afraid. It might just be my old friend Buddy, still out there, still learning, still wondering about the strange two-legged creatures that share his forest home. Because in the end, aren't we all just trying to understand each other a little better?